Welcome back, everyone. Tonight, the stories are about marriage, what it asks of people, what it reveals about them, and what happens when the asking and the revealing produce something neither person anticipated when they said yes. These are stories about the long relationships, the ones that were supposed to be permanent, and what the people inside them found when the permanence turned out to be conditional. Get comfortable, let's get into it. Someone spent 11 years married to a person who was, by every visible measure, entirely devoted, and found out in the final year that the devotion had a definition she had never been shown. My husband's name was Daniel, and he was the kind of person who made devotion look effortless. Not performatively. He was not a grand gesture person, not someone who expressed love through the kind of displays that are designed to be witnessed. He expressed it through consistency. He was there in the ordinary ways that accumulate into a life. Present at dinner, attentive to the small things, reliable in the specific and unglamorous sense of someone who does what they say they will do without requiring acknowledgement for the doing. 11 years of that kind of presence builds a trust that doesn't feel like trust anymore, because it has become the texture of the environment itself. The final year began like the others. What changed in it was not Daniel's behavior toward me, which remained consistent in the ways I've described. What changed was something I became aware of gradually and then understood all at once, in the way that certain understandings arrive. The gradual accumulation reaching a point where the picture assembles without warning. He had been having a sustained emotional relationship with a woman he had known professionally for 3 years. Not a physical relationship, or not primarily. I want to be accurate about what it was because accuracy matters more than the version that would be simpler to tell. It was the kind of relationship that lives into the register just below the threshold of what most people would call an affair, while exceeding the threshold of what a married person should be sustaining with someone who is not their spouse. I found out through his phone, which I was not searching. He had asked me to check a message from a contractor we were both dealing with, and the phone was open, and the wrong conversation was visible for long enough. The specific detail of the contractor is the kind of thing the brain anchors to in moments of significant discovery. The mundane fact that surrounds the significant one. We were renovating our kitchen. The kitchen renovation continued after I found out and was completed 6 months later. And I've not been able to look at the finished kitchen without the specific feeling of something built on top of something else. I did not say anything that evening. I gave myself 4 days, which was the time I needed to move from the acute phase of what I had seen into something more functional, and to understand what I was going to do with the information before I introduced it into our shared life. The 4 days were the most privately difficult days I had experienced inside the marriage, and also the most clarifying. The kind of clarity that arrives when something you have been trusting completely is suddenly available for examination. I told Daniel what I had seen on the 5th day. His response was not denial. It was the specific quality of someone whose concealed thing has been named, and who has been, on some level, waiting for the naming. He confirmed the relationship, and he described it in terms that were intended to distinguish it from the category I was placing it in, which was the category of betrayal. He said it had never been physical in the way that I was imagining. He said it had been a connection he had not known how to end, and had not known how to disclose. He said it had been, for him, separate from us, a thing that existed in a different compartment from the marriage, which he said he valued and had not been trying to undermine. The compartment explanation was the one I examined most carefully across the weeks that followed, because it was the explanation that required me to consider whether the compartment was real or whether it was the architecture of self-justification that people construct to make the things they are doing livable to themselves. I concluded, after significant examination, that both were true. The compartment was a real psychological structure, and it was also a self-justifying one. And the two things coexisted in Daniel's account of himself, without either one canceling the other. We spent 4 months in the attempt. Couples therapy, the honest conversations that couples therapy produces, the specific hard work of two people who are trying to determine whether what they have is worth the repair would require. What I discovered in those 4 months was not that Daniel had not loved me. He had, and did. What I discovered was that the consistency I had trusted for 11 years had a specific limit that I had not known about, which was the limit of what the consistency would prevent him from doing. When something outside the marriage offered something, the marriage was not providing. The consistency had not been unconditional. I had believed it was unconditional. The 11 years of its unconditionality had made the belief feel like knowledge rather than assumption. We did not survive the 4 months of attempt, not because the love was insufficient. It may have been sufficient, I am not certain. Because the unconditional quality I had built the trust on had been revealed as conditional. And rebuilding trust on a conditional foundation requires being certain you can live inside the conditionality. And I was not certain, and the uncertainty was its own answer. The kitchen is nice, I will say that with the honesty it deserves. The renovation was well done, and the kitchen is genuinely nice, and I live in it every day with the layered feeling of someone in a space that was built during the specific period that ended something, and the layering is simply the texture of the kitchen now, rather than a wound. Most things become texture eventually. The unconditional trust has not become texture yet. It is still the thing I'm working on. That's where that one starts us tonight. The compartment explanation being both a real psychological structure and a self-justifying one simultaneously is the most honest assessment available for that kind of situation. It refuses the simpler verdict of either pure rationalization or genuine innocence and sits in the accurate, uncomfortable middle. The kitchen as the thing the brain anchored to during the discovery, and then as the thing built during the ending, is the specific image this story earns rather than chooses. The domestic and the significant layered into the same object, neither canceling the other, just coexisting in the way that complicated things coexist in spaces we continue to inhabit. The next one arrives from a different angle entirely. A man who initiated a divorce after 16 years, who was certain it was the right decision, and who found in the aftermath that certainty and rightness are not the same category. I left. That is the beginning of the accurate version. I was the one who ended it, which is the part of the story that most tellings of divorce leave underexamined when the person telling it is the one who left. The leaving feels like agency, and agency feels like clarity, and clarity is supposed to feel like not suffering. And the specific thing I want to describe is what it is like to have made the right decision and to suffer from it anyway, which was not something I had prepared for. Her name was Grace, and we had been married for 16 years, and the marriage had not been a bad one in the ways that bad marriages are identifiable from the outside. No cruelty, no infidelity, no catastrophic incompatibility that announced itself as such. What the marriage had was a quieter problem, a growing distance between who both of us were becoming and who the marriage had been built around, a divergence of direction that had been gradual enough to be individually imperceptible and that had accumulated across 16 years into something that was no longer deniable if you looked at it directly. I looked at it directly at 41, which the looking was not prompted by a specific event. It was the outcome of a year of private examination that had arrived without a dramatic catalyst, at a conclusion I could not undecide once I had decided it. The marriage was not working in a way that repair could address, because the thing that wasn't working was not broken so much as incompatible with what both of us had become, and the becoming was real and ongoing and was not going to reverse. I told Grace on a Sunday in November. The conversation was the hardest one I have ever had, not because of how it went. She was not immediately hostile, which I had feared, but because of what it required me to watch. I watched someone receive information that reorganized their understanding of what they were inside in real time, across a conversation I was responsible for initiating. The watching was its own specific cost that I had not calculated when I had been calculating the costs of leaving. The legal process took 14 months. During those 14 months, I lived in an apartment 2 miles from the house I had shared with Grace for 11 of our 16 years, and I experienced, with a consistency I had not anticipated, the specific suffering of someone who has made the right decision and is still suffering from it. The suffering was not regret. I examined it regularly for regret and did not find it there. It was something more like the cost of clarity, the price of having looked directly at something and seen it accurately and acted on what the seeing produced. Grace was angry for a long time. The anger was legitimate and I received it as legitimate, which is not the same as receiving it as comfortable. She had not seen the decision coming with the clarity I had been developing internally for a year, which meant the 14 months of legal process were, for her, also the first 14 months of understanding that the marriage had been over in my accounting before it was over in hers. The asymmetry of that, my year of private conclusion versus her 14 months of catching up to a decision she had not participated in, is the thing I have examined most carefully since, because it is the thing I would have done differently if I had known how to do it differently, which I am not certain I would have. 2 years out of the marriage, I can say the decision was right in the way that decisions can be right without being painless or clean or finished. Grace has built something in the 2 years that appears, from the available evidence, to be genuinely good for her, which I hold with a complicated gratitude that I did not expect to feel, and that I think is the accurate response to someone you spent 16 years with, finding their footing after you remove the ground. My own footing is less certain than I had expected it to be at 2 years out. I had imagined clarity producing a faster resolution of the uncertainty than it has. The uncertainty is less about whether I made the right decision and more about what comes next, which turns out to be its own extended project, regardless of how clearly you saw the thing that preceded it, right? The suffering of someone who has made the right decision being distinguishable from regret is the specific psychological territory this story occupies, that most divorce narratives don't, not the tortured ambivalence of someone uncertain about their choice, but the specific cost of certainty, which turns out to have its own weight regardless of the correctness of the decision it produced. Grace's 14 months of catching up to a conclusion the narrator had been reaching for a year is named honestly as the asymmetry it was, and the narrator's acknowledgement that they would have done it differently without knowing how to is the kind of self-implication that makes this account credible rather than self-serving. Here's one that begins not with the marriage ending, but with what the marriage ending revealed about the years that had come before it. We had been, I believed, happy, not the performative kind of happy that couples perform for the people around them while operating on a different truth privately. Genuinely happy, in the specific and unself-conscious way of people who have found a life together that fits and who are not thinking about the fitting, because it is simply the way things are. Marcus and I had been married for 9 years, and the 9 years had been good in ways I could enumerate and in ways I could not. The way goodness settles into a life and becomes the heir rather than to the event. He asked for the divorce in March. The asking had the quality of something that had been decided before it was said, which is the specific quality of a conversation that arrives as a delivery rather than a discussion. He had not been processing the decision with me in the way of someone who is uncertain. He had been processing it privately, arriving at it privately, and presenting it to me as an arrived-at thing rather than a question he was still inside. The days after March were the days in which my understanding of the 9 years began to change. Not because I received new information immediately, but because the decision itself was information about what the 9 years had been containing that I had not known they were containing. If Marcus had arrived at this decision, the decision had been in process for some time before March. The process had been happening inside our marriage, inside our shared life, inside the specific ordinary days of 9 years that I had been experiencing as simply the days, while he had been, apparently, doing something else with them. I asked him when. Not when had he decided. When had he started to know? He was quiet in the way that questions produce quiet when they are harder to answer than they appear. And then he said he thought he had known something was wrong for 2 years. 2 years? And I did the arithmetic of the 2 years against the 9, and I held the result, which was that almost a quarter of the marriage had been lived by one of us in the knowledge of something the other did not know. What I found most difficult to hold was not the 2 years themselves. People go through periods of private uncertainty and private examination, and I understood that, in principle. What I found most difficult was the specific events of the 2 years, which I now went through in my memory with the new information applied to them. A vacation in the first of the 2 years that had been, from my side, wonderful. The second anniversary of our daughter's adoption, which had been warm and celebratory. The ordinary evenings and the particular mornings and the things he had said during those 2 years that had been said from inside a knowledge he had not shared. The memories were the same memories. They were also different memories now, viewed through a different context, and the viewing was irreversible. Marcus was not cruel in how he handled the ending. He was fair in the legal dimensions and honest when I asked direct questions and present for our daughter in the ways that mattered most. The cruelty, if cruelty is the right word for something that may not have been intentional, and it was in the 2 years and what they had cost in terms of decisions I had made during them. Decisions about our life and our future and what I was building from a position of incomplete information. I had been making the plans of someone inside a stable marriage, while he had been inside a different version of the same marriage. And the plans and the version had not been in communication. 4 years out, I have a life that is mine in a way that the marriage, in retrospect, had not fully been. The retrospect is complicated because it is built on the 9 years, and the 9 years were real. And the real quality of them is not retroactively eliminated by what March produced or by what the 2 years contained. What I have done is learn to hold both the realness and the complication without requiring them to resolve into a single verdict, which is harder than either the version where the marriage was good and the ending was a tragedy, or the version where the marriage was secretly broken and the ending was a revelation. The honest version is messier than either of those. Most honest versions are. That one sits differently from the others because the injury isn't located in a specific act, but in the arithmetic. 9 years, 2 of them lived in asymmetric knowledge. And the specific retrospective recontextualization of memories that were formed in good faith inside a marriage that was already in a different state on one side of it. The vacation detail is the one that lands hardest, not because it is the most significant, but because it is the most ordinary. A genuinely wonderful trip that now has a second layer the narrator did not choose and cannot remove. The decision to hold the realness and the complication without requiring them to resolve is the emotional maturity the story is building toward, and the narrator names the difficulty of that holding, honestly, rather than presenting it as an achievement. Someone met their ex-husband at 23 and was with him for 14 years before finding out that the person she had spent 14 years, becoming herself alongside, had been presenting a version of themselves to her that was specifically curated in ways she had not been shown. 23 is young to meet the person you will spend 14 years with, which means it is also young to be the person you are when you meet them. I was in the process of becoming when I met Elliot, and so was he. And the becoming happened alongside each other in the specific way of people who are young together, which is to say that some of what I became was shaped by who he was, and some of what he became was shaped by who I was, and the shaping was mutual and real and not something I've wanted to undo, even in the hardest periods of understanding what the 14 years actually were. What I found at the end of the 14 years was something I've taken considerable time to find accurate language for, because the inaccurate versions are available and easier to reach for, and not what I want to carry. The version that is accurate is this. Elliot had been, across the 14 years, selectively honest with me in a pattern that had a direction. The things he disclosed were real. The things he did not disclose were also real. And the not disclosed things had a consistent character, which was that they were the things most likely to produce a version of him that I would have assessed as less than what he was presenting. I do not mean infidelity. I mean something more pervasive and, in some ways, more difficult to name than infidelity, which is the sustained presentation of a self that has been edited in a specific direction. The removal of the parts that feel most vulnerable or most unflattering, and he replaced not with fabrication but with absence, so that what remains is true without being complete. He had done this not manipulatively, or not primarily manipulatively, but from a place of genuine fear about being seen fully by the person whose opinion of him mattered most. The fear was real. The editing was its product. I was inside the product for 14 years without knowing it was edited. The understanding arrived through therapy, my own, which I began in year 12 of the marriage, for reasons that were not directly about the marriage, and that became, across 2 years of the therapy, increasingly about the marriage. The therapist asked questions that I found, over time, had answers that were different from the answers I had been giving myself, and the different answers assembled a picture of the dynamic between Elliot and me that was more complete and more uncomfortable than the picture I had been holding. I brought what the therapy produced into the marriage, not as accusations, as questions, offered in the way of someone who is genuinely trying to understand something rather than prosecute it. Elliot received the questions with the quality of someone who had been waiting for them and was relieved and terrified simultaneously. The conversations that followed were the most honest ones we had had in 14 years, and they produced a clearer picture of both of us than the 14 years of daily proximity had produced, which is the specific irony of deep familiarity that assumes it is knowledge when it is actually comfort with a curated version. We tried for 2 years after the conversations began. The trying was real, and the therapy was real, and the progress was real in the ways that therapy measures progress. Elliot became more honest, more willing to show the unedited version, more capable of the vulnerability he had been managing around for 14 years. The progress was not sufficient for the marriage, which was the hardest conclusion the 2 years of trying produced. Not because the progress wasn't real, also, but because 2 years of genuine progress toward authenticity in a relationship is not the same as 14 years of authenticity. And the 14 years had built a dynamic between us that the 2 years of different behavior had not yet replaced. I hold the 14 years as real. I hold the editing as real. I hold the person Elliot became in the 2 years of trying as real, which is the most complicated piece because the person he became in those 2 years was the person I had wanted to be married to, and the marriage ended as he was becoming that person. And the timing is its own specific difficulty that I have not yet finished sitting with. He is that person now, or closer to it, in a life that is no longer mine. The information arrived in the right order for his becoming and the wrong order for the marriage. And the two things are both true, and I'm still deciding what to do with the fact of both of them. The timing is a specific injury this story names that most of the others tonight haven't touched. The person Elliot became, arriving as the marriage was ending, which means the narrator is processing both the loss of the marriage and the presence of the person they had wanted to be married to in the same period, which is a specific and uncommon kind of grief. Then the edited self being the product of fear rather than manipulation. is the distinction that makes the narrator's ongoing complexity about the 14 years credible. This is not a story about being deceived by someone who intended to deceive, but about being alongside someone whose fear produced an editing that had the same structural effect as deception without the intention. The sitting with the wrong order is the right place to leave it. Someone spent 7 years married and discovered the week after signing the divorce papers that the narrative of why the marriage had ended, the narrative she had been carrying and telling and building her recovery around, was missing a significant piece that her ex-husband had not provided, and that changed the shape of everything she thought she understood. The narrative I had been carrying was this: we had grown apart in the specific way of two people who had married young and had become, across 7 years, people who were better suited to different lives than the one they had built together. It was a clean narrative in the way that clean narratives are clean, which is that it assigned no particular fault and required no particular villain, and allowed both of us to exit the marriage as people who had tried and had arrived honestly at a conclusion that the trying could not prevent. I had told this narrative to my family and to my friends and to myself, and the telling had organized my understanding of the 7 years and of the ending and of what came next. The piece that was missing arrived through a friend of a friend, the specific social mechanism of information that travels through mutual acquaintances rather than directly, which is both the most common and the most complicated delivery system for significant revelations. The friend of a friend had been at a gathering where my ex-husband, whose name was Paul, had said something about the marriage that did not match the clean narrative. He had said it without apparent awareness that it would reach me, which is either naivety or confidence about social distance that turned out to be misplaced. What he had said was that the marriage had ended because he had been certain for the final 2 years that he wanted a different kind of life than the one the marriage was producing, and that the different kind of life had a specificity to it that the clean narrative of mutual incompatibility did not capture. The specificity was that he had known what he wanted and had been unable to tell me directly, because telling me directly would have required a conversation about who he was and what he wanted that he had not been ready to have. He had instead allowed the marriage to continue on the momentum of mutual growing apart, while privately knowing that the growing apart had a direction and a destination that was his rather than ours. I sat with this for a long time. The clean narrative and the specific narrative were not incompatible in their conclusions. Both ended with the marriage ending for reasons of incompatibility. What was different was the agency in the specific narrative, which was Paul's rather than the marriage's. The growing apart had not been the mutual drift of two people becoming different. It had been one person moving towards something specific, while the other person experienced the movement as undirected drift. I had been inside an undirected drift that had a direction I had not been shown. The recovery I had been building was built on the clean narrative, which meant it was built on an understanding of the 7 years that was missing the specific narrative's agency. I had been recovering from something that had happened to both of us. I now understood I had been inside something that had been happening to me in a way that Paul had been more aware of than he had disclosed. The recovery did not stop being valid. The work of it was still the work. The understanding of myself that the therapy and the time had produced was still real, but it was built on an incomplete foundation, and the incompleteness required a significant restructuring of what I understood I was recovering from. I called Paul. The call was the most controlled, difficult conversation I've had. Controlled because I had given myself a week after receiving the information before making the call, and the week had produced a version of the conversation that was specific and non-accusatory, rather than simply the output of the hurt in its acute phase. I told him what I had heard and asked him to tell me the accurate version directly. He gave it to me, with more honesty than the clean narrative had suggested he was capable of. which was its own complicated information about who he had become in the 2 years since the divorce. He said he was sorry he had not told me during the marriage and sorry he had not told me during the divorce process. He said he had not known how and had told himself the clean narrative was close enough to true, that the specific narrative was not necessary, which is the specific self-justification of someone who has decided that a near truth is sufficient because the full truth requires a conversation they cannot have. I told him the near truth had cost me 2 years of recovery, built on an incomplete understanding, and that I needed him to know that, not as a punishment, but as accurate information about the cost of his decision. He said he understood. The understanding arrived in the conversation as genuine and also arrived too late to be anything other than information, which is what most understandings that arrive after the relevant period are: information rather than repair. I took the information and I restructured the recovery around the specific narrative rather than the clean one, and found that the restructured version was harder and more accurate and more mine than the version it replaced. That's how this one opens the chunk. The clean narrative being the thing the recovery was built on is the specific structural problem this story produces. Not the divorce itself, but the understanding of the divorce, which had been organized around a version of events that was close enough to true to feel accurate without being complete. Paul's near truth being sufficient to himself, because the full truth required a conversation he couldn't have, is the mechanism named correctly, and the narrator's need to tell him the cost, not as punishment, but as information, is the right move. The one that converts the revelation from something that simply happens to her into something she has a response to that is hers. A woman found herself inside what she can only describe as the administrative aftermath of a marriage that ended, and discovered in the administrative aftermath something about herself she had not known the marriage had been preventing her from finding. The administrative aftermath of a divorce is not something people describe adequately in advance. I was not prepared for the specific texture of it. The paperwork and the account separations and the insurance and the beneficiary changes and the deed and the subscriptions and the dozens of small bureaucratic threads that a 14-year marriage weaves into a life, and that the ending of the marriage requires you to locate and separate one at a time. My ex-husband's name was Robert, and our marriage had been, practically speaking, significantly integrated in the way that long marriages become integrated. Finances, accounts, the ordinary administrative infrastructure of a shared life that accumulates so gradually you stop seeing it until you are required to take it apart piece by piece. The taking apart required me to engage with the administrative dimensions of my own life in ways I had not engaged with them inside the marriage. Robert had been, within our arrangement, the person who managed the financial and administrative architecture. Not because I was incapable, I was not incapable, but because the arrangement had found its shape early in the marriage, and the shape had been maintained by the inertia of what worked rather than by ongoing conscious choice. I had contributed in other domains. He had contributed in that one. The arrangement had felt equitable in the way that long-standing arrangements feel equitable when you have stopped examining them. Taking apart the arrangement required me to become, for the first time in 14 years, the person who managed the financial and administrative architecture. The becoming was not immediate. It had a learning curve, and the learning curve had uncomfortable moments. Instances of competence I had assumed I lacked, turning out to be competence I had simply not been required to exercise. Each account I separated and managed, each insurance policy I understood and revised, or each financial decision I made without the arrangement's prior structure. Each of these was information about myself that the marriage had not been producing, and that the administrative aftermath was producing in its place. What I found in the administrative aftermath was a person who was more capable than the marriage had required her to be, and the finding was simultaneously a gift and an indictment. A gift because the capability was genuinely mine, and was now available to me in ways it had not been, and an indictment because the 14 years had been organized around an arrangement that had not required it and had therefore not produced the evidence that it existed. I had been inside an arrangement that worked without me needing to know things I was fully capable of knowing, and the not needing had prevented the knowing, and the preventing had produced a specific blind spot about my own competence that the divorce's administrative aftermath was now correcting. I want to be clear that I am not describing Robert as having deliberately limited me. The arrangement was mutual and was not designed with the purpose of keeping me from my own capabilities. It was the natural output of a long marriage's division of labor, finding its equilibrium, and the equilibrium had costs that neither of us had examined because the equilibrium felt like it worked. The cost I am describing was mine to bear in the aftermath rather than a harm he had knowingly produced, and the distinction matters for how I hold the 14 years, which I hold as real and in some ways genuinely good, while also holding the cost. In 3 years out of the marriage, I managed the administrative architecture of my life with a fluency that would have surprised the person I was during the marriage, and the surprise itself is information about what the marriage had been containing without either of us fully seeing it. The capability was always there. The arrangement was what was covering it. I do not know what the arrangement was covering for Robert. That is his accounting to do rather than mine. What I know is my own accounting, which is that the administrative aftermath of a divorce, for all its exhaustion and difficulty, was also the first extended period in 14 years in which I was required to be fully present to the practical dimensions of my own life, and the requirement produced something I had not known I had been missing. And the administrative aftermath, as the site of self-discovery, is the unexpected angle this story takes and earns. Not the emotional processing of the ending, not the grief, but the paperwork, which turns out to be where a significant piece of the self-knowledge was waiting. The arrangement not being a deliberate limitation, but a mutual equilibrium. With costs neither party examined is the honest framing that keeps this from being a simple story about a controlling marriage. It was an ordinary division of labor that produced an ordinary blind spot, which is in some ways more recognizable and more worth examining than the dramatic version. This one comes from a man who was married for 22 years and who found, in the 3 years after the divorce, that the person he had been inside the marriage was a person he could not find any evidence of outside it. Her name was Janet, and we had been together since our late 20s, and the 22 years had been, in most of the ways that matter for a long assessment, a good marriage. I am aware that this statement sounds like the preamble to a revelation that the marriage was secretly not good, and I want to resist that reading because it is not accurate. The marriage was genuinely good. The children are grown and healthy, and the relationships within the family are intact. And the house was sold fairly, and the process of ending was conducted with a civility that I attributed at the time to mutual respect, and that I now understand was also a function of 22 years of practice at getting along, which does not stop producing its output simply because the relationship that generated it has ended. What I found in the 3 years after the divorce was a problem I had not anticipated, which was the specific problem of not knowing who I was outside the marriage. I do not mean this in the dramatic sense of an identity crisis. I mean it in the more specific and practical sense of discovering that the preferences and habits and ways of being that I understood as mine had been developed inside the marriage and expressed themselves primarily in relation to it. I liked what I liked, thought what I thought, organized my days the way I organized my days, and almost all of it had been formed in the context of a marriage that was no longer there, which meant almost all of it was pointing toward an absence. The preferences were the most specific evidence of this. I discovered across the 3 years that I did not know what I liked to eat when I was not considering what Janet liked to eat. Not because she had controlled my diet, she had not, but because 22 years of shared meals had produced a set of preferences that were genuinely shared, rather than individually held, and the genuinely shared preferences were now without their other half and revealed themselves as more dependent on the context of sharing than I had realized. I stood in a grocery store in month 3 of being alone and found that the question of what to buy for dinner produced a blankness I had not expected, and that took longer to fill than it should have. The social life had the same quality. My friends had been, for most of the 22 years, people I had known through Janet or through the joint social world the marriage had produced, and the joint social world had reorganized itself in the ways that social worlds reorganize after a long marriage ends. Some people staying close, some people choosing one party over the other, in ways that are not always conscious. The general reconfiguration of a social ecosystem around a new arrangement. What I found in the reconfigured ecosystem was that I did not have a clear sense of who my people were when the people were not the marriage's people. Nay, and the finding was uncomfortable in the specific way of things that reveal a dependency you had not known you had. I am not describing this as Janet's fault or as the marriage's fault. The dependency was mine and was the natural product of a 22-year investment in a shared life, without a corresponding investment in the individual self that existed alongside the shared one. I had been a husband and a father and a professional, and I had done those things well by most measures, and I had not been attending to the individual self with the same consistency, and the individual self was now the only remaining domain, and it was less developed than the shared one had been. 3 years of active work on the individual self has produced a person who knows, with increasing specificity, what he likes and who he is when there is no marriage to organize the knowing around. The work is not finished, and I'm not certain it finishes. I think it is simply ongoing, in the way that self-knowledge is ongoing rather than a project with a completion date. What I can say at 3 years is that the blankness in the grocery store has resolved into something more specific and more mine, and the social world has reorganized around people I have chosen rather than people the marriage produced. And the individual self is more present and more legible than it was when the divorce removed the context that had been making it unnecessary to develop. The grocery store blankness is the image that carries the whole story, specific and ordinary, and precisely right as the location of a significant discovery about a 22-year marriage's effects. The individual self being less developed than the shared self, not as fault but as the natural product of where the investment had been concentrated, is the kind of honest self-examination that makes this narrator credible, and the ongoing rather than finished quality of the 3-year work is the accurate description of what self-knowledge actually is as a project, which is indefinite rather than completable. Here's one that moves differently from the others. Not a long marriage, but a short one, 4 years, and what the shortness meant for how both people understood what they had been inside. My ex-wife's name was Simone, and we were married for 4 years, and the 4 years were intense in the way that short things are sometimes intense. Compressed, without the gradual weathering that long marriages accumulate. Vivid in the way of something that has not had time to become ordinary. I have found in the years since that people receive the 4 years differently depending on their own relationship to duration. Some people hear 4 years and think short, as in not long enough to count as a real marriage in the full sense. And some people hear 4 years and think concentrated, as in enough time for everything that matters to happen, just without the buffer of ordinary years that long marriages use to absorb the significant ones. The divorce was mutual in the specific way that mutual means something different in practice than in the telling of it. We had both arrived at the conclusion, but we had arrived at it from different directions and at different speeds, and the conclusion being the same did not mean the journeys toward it were equivalent. I had been certain for several months before the conversation that ended the marriage. Simone had not been certain until the conversation itself, which meant the conversation was, for me, the delivery of an arrived-at conclusion, and for her, the beginning of a process of arriving at one. What I found in the aftermath of the 4 years was something I want to describe carefully because the careless version is unfair to what the 4 years actually were. The careful version is this: the 4 years had been genuinely good and had also been, from early in the marriage, operating at a pitch that neither of us had acknowledged as unsustainable. The intensity was the thing we had both loved about it at the beginning, the quality that had made the relationship feel like the real thing after relationships that had felt like lesser versions of it. And the intensity had been real and had also been the thing that had made the 4 years vivid without making them sustainable. Simone and I had not had time to become ordinary to each other. In a longer marriage, the extraordinary periods are absorbed into the ordinary ones, and the ordinary ones are what most of the marriage is: the regular evenings, the unremarkable weekends, the texture of daily proximity that makes a long marriage what it is. We had not accumulated enough ordinary to absorb the extraordinary, which meant the extraordinary had been that the primary texture of the 4 years, which meant the 4 years had been sustained at a level that was the exception in long marriages rather than the rule. The divorce was hard in the specific way that things are hard when they are compressed. The grief of 4 years is not a smaller grief than the grief of 14 years. It is a differently shaped one, without the long buffer of ordinary time to look back on, without the decades of shared history that give a long marriage's ending a different kind of weight. What it has instead is the specific grief of something that was vivid and brief, which is sometimes harder to hold than the grief of something that was long and gradual, because vivid things leave a specific kind of absence that gradual things do not. 3 years after the 4 years, I understand the marriage as the thing it was, rather than as a shorter version of what a longer marriage would have been. It was not a failed attempt at a long marriage. It was a 4-year marriage that was fully what it was: intense and real, and not designed for continuation. And the not designed for continuation was not a flaw in its construction, but a feature of its particular character. I have stopped measuring the 4 years against what it would have been at 14 or 22. It was 4 years, and it was complete in the way that the 4 years made possible. And the completeness is what I am learning to hold, rather than the shortness. The reframe this story proposes: the 4 years as complete in itself, rather than truncated, is the specific piece of self-knowledge this narrator is building toward, and the building is still in progress rather than finished, which is what makes it honest rather than resolved. The grief of vivid brief things being differently shaped rather than smaller than the grief of long gradual ones is the distinction that earns its own space in tonight's collection. Duration is not the same as significance, and significance is not always proportionate to duration. And the 4 years were significant in the specific way of things that are fully themselves without being long. Someone spent 13 years building what she believed was the most honest relationship of her life, and discovered at its end that the honesty had been running on a specific and previously undisclosed exception that her husband had maintained from the first year of the marriage. The exception was not dramatic in its category. I want to be precise about this before describing it, because the temptation to receive this kind of story in its most dramatic available version is real, and the dramatic version is not the accurate one. What my husband kept from me was not another person or a secret life or a financial crime. And it was a belief, a specific and deeply held belief about what he wanted from life that was different from what the marriage was structured around, and that he had held privately since year one, while participating fully in the structure the marriage required. His name was Patrick, and the belief was about children. We had two. The having of them had been a shared decision, in the way that such decisions are shared, discussed, agreed upon, and entered into together with the apparent mutuality that significant life decisions require when two people make them as a unit. I had not known until year 13 that the mutuality had been, on Patrick's side, a decision made against his own private position. that he had agreed to the children, not from genuine desire, but from the specific accommodation of someone who has decided that what their partner wants matters more than their own divergent preference, and who has not told their partner this because the telling would require a conversation about the divergence that feels too large and too destabilizing to have. I found out through Patrick himself, which is relevant to how I received it. He told me, not under pressure and not as the result of discovery, voluntarily in year 13, as the marriage was in a period of difficulty for unrelated reasons, because he had decided that the difficulty had created a context in which the telling was more necessary than it had been in the 12 years before it. He said he had been carrying it since year 1, and that carrying it had become something he could no longer justify. In a marriage he was asking me to work on without having given me the full information. I sat across from him in our kitchen, and I heard him say this, and I held it in real time while continuing to be in the same room as the person who had said it. The 2 children were in their rooms down the hall. The specific geography of the moment, the kitchen, the hallway, the rooms down the hall, is the thing my memory has fixed on in the years since, because the ordinary domestic space was the location of something that reorganized everything the ordinary domestic space contained. I asked him what the 13 years had been like, carrying that. Not as a challenge, as a genuine question, because I could not assemble the answer on my own, and I needed his version of it. He said it had been both easier and harder than he had expected. Easier because the children had become real to him in ways the abstract preference against them had not prepared him for. He loved them, he said, with a sincerity I did not question then, and do not question now. Harder because the love did not dissolve the original divergence, which had continued to be present underneath the love, across the 13 years, as the specific cost of a decision made against his own private position. The marriage did not survive the telling, which I want to name clearly because the surviving or not surviving is relevant to how the telling should be understood. We tried for 8 months after the telling, and the trying was real and produced genuine understanding between us, and did not produce the repair the marriage needed, which was a repair of a foundation that had been built on an incomplete set of materials. The incomplete foundation was not discoverable from inside the marriage, because the incompleteness had been maintained with the care of someone who had decided the incomplete version was what the marriage required. I hold Patrick with a complicated care that is not simplified across the years since. He was not a cruel person. The choice to carry the exception privately was made from a place that included love for me and love for the children, and the specific fear of someone who has seen the thing that might destroy what they most value and has decided not to introduce it, because the introduction feels more dangerous than the carrying. The carrying was wrong in its effects and real in its motivation, and I have found that holding both of those things simultaneously is the most accurate way to hold what the 13 years were. The geography is what makes this story's opening image. The kitchen, the hallway, the rooms down the hall, land with the weight it carries. The ordinary domestic space as the location of the extraordinary revelation is not a literary choice on the narrator's part. It is simply where it happened. And the fixation on the specific geography is the brain doing what it does with significant moments, anchoring them to their physical coordinates so they can be located, rather than simply felt. Patrick's love for the children, not dissolving the original divergence, is the most honest and most complicated piece of what he describes. 2 things coexisting in the same person, without either one eliminating the other, which is the specific human condition this story is built around. Up next, a man who went through a divorce at 53 and found that the version of himself that emerged on the other side of it was someone he recognized from a period of his life he had believed was permanently behind him. My marriage had lasted 26 years. I want to say that number plainly and let it sit because it is the context for everything else. 26 years is most of my adult life, and most of my adult life have been organized around the marriage and the way that a long marriage organizes a life, which is completely and in ways you only see when the organization is removed. Her name was Carol, and the divorce was, in the legal and procedural sense, something we had both arrived at by the time the process began. The arriving had taken several years and had involved the kind of slow and painful examination that people who have been together for 26 years conduct when they are trying to determine whether what they have built is worth the work of rebuilding into something that functions again, or whether the honest answer is that the building has concluded, and the conclusion should be acknowledged rather than deferred. We acknowledged it. The process was as fair as a 26-year process can be, which is to say, imperfectly fair, in ways that both of us accepted as the best available version of fairness. What I did not expect was who I found when the organization was removed. The person who emerged in the months after the divorce was someone I recognized from a specific period of my life, my late 20s, before the marriage, before the organization had been established. The recognition was not comfortable immediately because the late 20s version of me had been someone I had understood as a prior self, a version that had been succeeded by the version the marriage produced, and the succession had felt like progress in the way that adult development is supposed to feel like progress. Finding the late 20s version present and active at 53 did not initially feel like the progress it eventually revealed itself to be. What the late 20s version had that the marriage years had not been producing was a specific quality of openness to uncertainty, to the unplanned, to the day that did not have a predetermined shape. The marriage, like all long marriages, had produced a structure that was a genuine comfort and that had also been, without my fully noticing the producing, in a management of uncertainty so complete that I had stopped having a relationship to uncertainty that was anything other than the management of it. The late 20s version of me had lived in uncertainty and had not managed it so much as inhabited it, and the inhabiting had a quality that the management had not. I want to be careful about romanticizing this, because the late 20s uncertainty had also been the uncertainty of someone who did not know what he was building toward, and was not always comfortable in the not knowing. What I found at 53 was not the late 20s uncertainty in its original form. It was that version's quality without the distress that had originally accompanied it, which is what 26 years of adult experience does to uncertainty when the uncertainty is returned to it. You know things at 53 that you did not know at 29, and the knowing changes the quality of the uncertainty without eliminating it. The person I am 3 years out of the 26-year marriage is a version of myself that contains the marriage years without being organized by them, and contains the late 20s version without being limited by it. I am not certain this is the final version. I am not certain there is a final version, which is itself something the late 20s self would have understood immediately, and the marriage years had made me forget. The forgetting had been comfortable, and the remembering is, in its specific way, also comfortable. And the two comforts are different in character, and I find I value the remembering more, which may be simply a function of which one is newer. The late 20s, self-returning at 53, is the specific image around which this story organizes itself, and the recognition of it as a prior self that was succeeded rather than erased is the psychological insight the narrator is doing the real work of in the aftermath of 26 years. In the distinction between the late 20s uncertainty with its original distress and the same uncertainty accessed through the knowledge of 53 is the careful piece. It is not a simple return to youth, but a recovery of a quality that the youth had first, and that the adult experience has now made it possible to hold differently. And this one arrives from someone who discovered at the end of her marriage that the story she and her husband had been telling about themselves as a couple, the origin story, the specific mythology of how they had found each other, had a version she had not been given. Every marriage has a mythology, the story of how you met, how you knew, the specific narrative that the couple tells together at dinners, and to new people, and to themselves on the occasions when the telling is useful. Ours was a good story, genuinely good, with the quality of the best origin stories, which is a combination of specificity and improbability that makes the how we met feel like the beginning of something that was supposed to happen. We had told it many times. I had told it alone, without Marcus present, in the way that you tell the stories of your life, when someone asks about the significant people in it. I believed the story I was telling. The version I had not been given arrived, as of all places, through a photograph. Not a discovered photograph. A photograph I had always known existed, that had been part of the story's physical record, that I had looked at many times over the 20-year marriage. I looked at it again in the month after Marcus had moved out, and I saw something in it that I had not seen before, which was a specific quality in the background of the image that I recognized, on this looking, as something that changed the timeline. And the timeline change was this. The photograph was dated in a way that placed it 2 months before the date our story said we had met, and the photograph showed Marcus in a context that connected him to my social world, in a way that was inconsistent with the story's version of us as strangers before the specific occasion of our meeting. He had been in my proximity before the story said he had been in my proximity, which meant the meeting had either been less coincidental than the story described, or had been preceded by a period of knowing about each other that the story had not included. I asked Marcus about the photograph. He was into the process of moving out, and we were not in a period of easy communication, but the question was specific enough that I asked it directly, and he received it directly. He confirmed that he had known about me before the meeting, that a mutual acquaintance had described me to him, that he had made a decision to be at the specific occasion where we met because he knew I would be there, and that the meeting had been, on his side, less coincidental than the story had described it. He said he had not told me because the telling would have changed the story's quality, would have made the beginning feel engineered rather than faded, and the faded quality was one he had not wanted to remove from something that had felt genuinely significant to him. He said that engineering had been in service of something real, that his interest in meeting me had been genuine, and that the marriage had been genuine, and that the not telling had been about protecting the story rather than deceiving me. I held his explanation, and I examined the 20 years through the lens of the photograph's timeline, and I found in the examination something unexpected. The version of the origin story that included Marcus's prior knowledge of me and his decision to be at the specific occasion was now, to my examination, a lesser story than the one I had been telling. It was a different story, more specific about the nature of his interest, more human in its account of how people arrange to encounter the people they want to encounter, less about fate and more about choice, and choice turned out to be a thing I valued more than fate once I had the choice version available. The 20 years had been what they had been, and the origin story had been told many times, and the version of the telling was now different, and the 20 years were unchanged by the different version. I am not still married to Marcus. The divorce had reasons that were not the photograph. The photograph was a detail in the larger story of the ending, rather than its cause. What the photograph produced was a revision of the mythology that I found, ultimately, more interesting than the version it replaced, which may say something about what I value in stories, and may say something about what I was ready to value at the point in my life when the revision arrived. The photograph as the mechanism of discovery is the specific detail that earns this story its own category. Not a message, not a confession, not a conversation with a mutual acquaintance, but the narrator looking at a known image with new eyes at a moment of significant change, and seeing something that had always been visible and had not previously been seen. Marcus's explanation prioritizing the faded quality of the story is the kind of self-justification that makes sense from inside and costs from outside. And The narrator's finding that the choice version is ultimately more interesting than the fate version is the unexpected turn that gives the story somewhere to go beyond the revelation. This one is from someone who spent 8 years in a marriage that ended through infidelity and who found in the years of processing that followed that the infidelity was not the thing the processing was actually about. I need to say first that the infidelity was real and was a genuine harm, and I am not revising the harm in what follows. What I am describing is the experience of someone who went through the expected grief of that specific harm and found beneath the expected grief a different grief that had been there longer and that the infidelity had exposed rather than caused. His name was Aaron, and the infidelity I discovered in year 8 was specific and significant and had a duration of approximately 9 months and involved someone I had met on several occasions and had considered part of our social world. The discovery was the kind that produces the immediate and acute pain that this kind of discovery produces. The specific quality of the world reorganizing itself around information you cannot unknow. And I moved through the immediate aftermath in the way that people move through acute pain, which is not gracefully, but with the specific determination of someone who has no other available option. The therapy I entered 3 months after the discovery was organized initially around the infidelity and around what the infidelity meant for the marriage, which we were in the process of attempting to salvage at the point I entered therapy. The salvage attempt lasted 7 months and did not succeed, and the therapy continued past the salvage attempt into the processing of the ending, which is where the different grief began to make itself known. The therapist asked questions that moved the conversation in a direction I had not been expecting, which was toward the years before the infidelity, and what those years had contained that I had not been examining, because the infidelity had been the organizing event of all the recent examination. The years before the infidelity had been the 8 years of the marriage, and the 8 years had contained something the infidelity had exposed rather than caused, a specific and long-standing insufficiency in how I had been known inside the marriage. That insufficiency was not Aaron's alone, and that is the part that the examination of the pre-infidelity years produced that was most difficult to receive. The recognition that the not being fully known had been a dynamic between us, rather than something he had done to me, and that my contribution to the dynamic had been a specific and sustained withholding of my own interior that had left both of us inside a marriage where the knowing was less complete than either of us had fully articulated. And Aaron had found the knowing he was missing somewhere outside the marriage. I had found a way to not need it that had expressed itself as the appearance of self-sufficiency inside the marriage. The therapist helped me understand that the appearance of self-sufficiency was not the same as actual self-sufficiency, and that the distinction was the thing the marriage had been unable to surface because I had not been available to be known in the way that would have required its surfacing. I had been inside a marriage without bringing the full version of myself to it, and the marriage had been diminished by the partial version without either of us naming what was diminishing it, and the infidelity had been the event that ended the marriage, while the partial version was the thing that had been limiting it across the 8 years. This is not an absolution of Aaron. He made a choice that I had not made and that I would not have made. The choice caused genuine harm. What I am describing is the processing that found beneath the harm a different and older wound that the harm had uncovered, and the different and older wound was mine to address rather than his to have caused. And addressing it has produced something in the years since the marriage that the 8 years of the marriage had not produced. I am more fully present in the relationships I am in now than I was in the 8 years of the marriage. The more full presence is the outcome of the processing rather than something I arrived at naturally, which means the processing was the thing that produced it, which means the processing was necessary in a way I could not have predicted from inside the marriage where the not full presence had been the only version available to me. I do not thank the infidelity for this. I credit the processing. The processing was mine. The structure of this story, the expected grief, and the different older grief beneath it, is the thing that makes it distinct from the others tonight that also involve infidelity. The narrator's recognition of their own contribution to the dynamic, without using it as an absolution, is the careful and necessary distinction, and the credit going to the processing, rather than to the pain that made the processing necessary, is the right assignment of credit. The different grief being older than the marriage itself is the revelation that places the marriage in a longer context than the 8 years, a context that the marriage had the opportunity to address and didn't, and that the ending provided the conditions to address instead. Someone spent 18 years married to a person who was, in all the ways that are visible from outside a marriage, a devoted and present partner, and discovered at the end of those 18 years that the devotion had been organized around a version of her that had stopped being accurate somewhere in the middle of the marriage and had continued to be the version her husband was devoted to, regardless of the actual version that had been developing in its place. Her name is not important to the story, but her husband's name was Thomas, and what Thomas had been devoted to was the person she had been at 28, which was when they had met. The 28-year-old version had been a specific person with specific qualities: quieter, less certain, more dependent on external validation than the person she had become across the 18 years of the marriage. The becoming had happened gradually and with Thomas's full witness, which is the specific confusion at the center of this story. He had watched her become someone different and had continued to relate to her as the person she had been, not with cruelty or with deliberate revision, but with the specific blindness of someone whose love has attached itself to a version, rather than to the person that version was in the process of becoming. She noticed it in year 14 in the way that you notice something that has been accumulating, not as a sudden recognition, but as the growing awareness of a friction between who she was and who Thomas seemed to be responding to. He consulted her about things she had outgrown being uncertain about. He protected her from difficulties she had developed the capacity to navigate. He spoke about her to other people in terms that she recognized as accurate to the 28-year-old and increasingly inaccurate to the 42-year-old. And the speaking was warm and loving and organized around a version she was no longer fully in. She raised it with Thomas in year 15. And the conversation was careful and honest on her side and received on his side, with a genuine confusion that told her the misalignment had been invisible to him. He had not been relating to an outdated version deliberately. He had been relating to the version he knew most completely, and the version he knew most completely was the one that had been present for the most years of his knowing. She told him she had changed. He said he knew she had changed. She said she was not certain he knew in the way that would change how he related to her, and the distinction required several more conversations to produce the understanding she was reaching for. The several more conversations produced something and did not produce enough. Thomas made genuine effort to update his relating. She could see the effort and credit it, and also feel that the effort was a performance of updating rather than a genuine revision of the internal version he was working from. The performance was well-intentioned and imperfect in the way that performances of things we do not naturally do are always imperfect, and the imperfection persisted across the 3 years between year 15 and year 18 when the marriage ended. The ending was not dramatic. It arrived through the accumulated recognition that the marriage had been organized around a version of her that she could no longer fully inhabit, and that Thomas could not fully revise. And the gap between the version and the person had become too wide to continue bridging through the mutual effort of two people who loved each other, but were operating on different versions of who they were loving. She does not believe Thomas was wrong to love the 28-year-old. She believes she was wrong to stay inside the marriage through 14 years of the version problem without naming it, which is the self-implication she has arrived at in the years since. The version problem is the thing the story is built around, and the most specific contribution it makes to tonight's collection. And being loved devotedly for the person you were, rather than the person you are becoming, is not the same as being loved inadequately. It is a different and more specific problem, the problem of love, that has fixed its object and cannot update the fixing. Thomas's confusion being genuine rather than defensive is what makes the story require the more complicated response the narrator eventually gives it, because genuine confusion is harder to address than deliberate misrepresentation. And this one is from someone who filed for divorce after 12 years and spent the 18 months of the legal process discovering that the person he was divorcing was someone he had not fully known, and that the not fully knowing had been mutual rather than one-directional. The legal process has a specific quality that I had not anticipated, which is the quality of forced disclosure. The documents that divorce requires produce information in both directions, that the ordinary privacy of a marriage does not produce. Financial records and legal affidavits, and the administrative record of a shared life assembled for the purpose of its division. These things reveal dimensions of a person and a marriage, that the marriage itself does not require to be revealed, and that the ending makes impossible to keep private. I had understood this abstractly before the process began, and I had not understood it concretely until I was inside it. What the process revealed about my wife, whose name was Elaine, was not dramatic in its individual details. There were financial decisions she had made independently and not disclosed. There were professional circumstances she had described in terms that were more favorable than the document supported. There was a pattern in the administrative record of the marriage of information managed in a direction that I had not been aware I was being managed in. None of it was criminal. None of it, taken individually, was the kind of thing that would have produced a crisis if disclosed during the marriage. Together, assembled by the legal process into the administrative record of 12 years, the pattern had a character that I had to sit with and be honest about what it suggested. What it suggested was that Elaine had maintained a private administrative layer to her life, inside the marriage that had been invisible to me, because I had not been looking for it, and because the marriage had not required the level of transparency that the legal process was now demanding. The private layer was not the sign of a secret life or a deliberate fraud. It was the sign of a person who had maintained the habit of private management from before the marriage and had not fully dissolved that habit into the shared architecture of the marriage, which is different from deception, while also being different from the transparency a shared life is supposed to involve. What the process revealed about me was harder to sit with. The same documents that showed me Elaine's private administrative layer showed me the dimension of my own. I had my own undisclosed financial decisions, modest in their scale, and not dramatic in their nature, but undisclosed in the same way hers were. I had my own version of the private management habit, maintained from before the marriage and not fully dissolved into the shared architecture. The process assembled my administrative record alongside Elaine's, and the two records had a symmetry that was uncomfortable and clarifying simultaneously. We had been inside a marriage where both of us had maintained private layers that neither of us had disclosed, and the maintenance had been invisible to both of us, because neither of us had been looking for it in the other, and because the marriage had been comfortable enough that the looking was never required. The divorce had required the looking, and the looking had produced the symmetry, and the symmetry required a significant revision of the story I had been telling about the marriage, which had been a story in which I was more transparent than Elaine, and the transparency gap was hers to account for. I told Elaine what I had noticed in my own record at one of the mediation sessions. Not in front of the mediator, before the session and the specific window of private conversation that mediation produces between parties who have not yet fully dismantled their ability to speak to each other directly. She received it with the quality of someone who had noticed the same symmetry and had been uncertain whether I would name it. The naming changed the quality of the remaining 7 months of the process in a way I had not expected. Not a reconciliation, the divorce proceeded, but a shift in how both of us understood what we were ending and what we had been inside, which was a marriage between two people who were more similar in their private management habits than either of them had known, of the forced disclosure of the legal process, revealing something unexpected about both parties, is the structural move that distinguishes this story from the ones on either side of it tonight. The symmetry being the discovery, not that Elaine was concealing things, but that both of them were, and in similar ways, is the revision of the marriage's story that the narrator has to make honestly, rather than defensively. The naming of his own record before accusing hers of the same pattern is the right order, and the change it produces in the remaining process is proportionate to what it costs to produce it. Here's one from someone who was married for 10 years and who found, in the first year after the divorce, that the grief she was experiencing was not the grief she had expected, and that the unexpected grief was more accurate than the expected version would have been. The expected grief was for the marriage and for the person she had been married to, and for the life the two of them had built, and were now in the process of unbuilding. She had prepared for that grief in the way that a person prepares for something they know is coming and that they understand in advance will be significant. The preparation had involved therapy and honest conversations with close friends, and the reading of the things that are written about grief and what it requires and how it moves through a person across time. The expected grief arrived and was what it was, and she moved through it with the tools she had prepared and with the support of the people she had arranged for the purpose. What she had not prepared for was the grief that arrived alongside the expected grief, and that was, as she came to understand it across the first year, a grief for something that had ended before the marriage had ended. Something that had ended early in the marriage, and that she had been grieving privately and without acknowledgement inside the marriage for years before the divorce made the grief visible. Her husband's name was James, and the thing that had ended early in the marriage was not the love. The love was real and remained in a complicated form, even at the end. And what had ended was the specific quality of possibility that the early marriage had contained. The sense of two people who were still into the process of determining what their shared life would be, and whose joint future was still open and unscripted. That quality had been present in the first 2 or 3 years, and had then been replaced, gradually and naturally, by the specific quality of a life that has been determined. The shape established, the routines in place, the future, legible from the present, in a way that the beginning of the marriage had not allowed it to be. She had loved the early quality. She had loved it specifically and consciously, and had understood its loss as the ordinary cost of a marriage, maturing from its early phase into its sustained one. She had accepted the loss as acceptable and had not fully examined whether the acceptance was genuine or whether it was the management of a grief that had nowhere to go inside a marriage that was still ongoing. The first year after the divorce revealed that it had been the management of a grief rather than its resolution, because the divorce removed the reason for the management, and the grief that had been managed across several years emerged with a freshness that was not proportionate to the divorce's recency. She understood this through the specific experience of the grief arriving most strongly, not in relation to James or to the marriage's ending, but in relation to a period of the marriage, the early period, the years of open possibility, the specific texture of a future that was still being written. She was grieving the second and third years of a 10-year marriage inside the divorce proceedings of the marriage's ending, which was a temporal displacement that initially confused her, and that the therapy eventually helped her name accurately. The naming changed the character of the first year's grief without resolving it, when she understood that the divorce had two griefs inside it: the expected grief for what had just ended, and the older grief for what had ended years earlier and had been managed privately into the interim, and that the two griefs required different responses, even though they were arriving simultaneously. The expected grief required the standard tools and the standard support, and had a trajectory she could anticipate. In the older grief required something more specific, the acknowledgement that she had lost something inside the marriage long before the marriage ended, and that the loss had been real and had not been acknowledged, and that the acknowledgement was now necessary, regardless of how long after the fact it was arriving. The two griefs inside one divorce is the specific discovery this story offers that reframes the experience of grief after a long marriage ends. And now, the older grief, for what ended inside the marriage rather than at its conclusion, is not something most accounts of divorce include, which is probably because it requires the person to admit to grieving something within a marriage they were still in and still publicly representing as intact. The displacement being clarifying rather than confusing once named is the right endpoint for the story's first year. This one comes from a man who spent 15 years in a marriage that he would describe as genuinely happy, and who found, in the years after it ended, that genuinely happy and fully known are not the same category. I was happy. I want to say this without qualification because I think the unqualified saying of it is the honest version. The 15 years were years I valued while I was in them and would not undo if undoing were available. Claire and I were good together in the ways that matter most for daily life, compatible in our habits, aligned in our values, easy in each other's company, in the specific way that only develops through sustained proximity and sustained goodwill. The happiness was real, and I knew it was real while I was inside it, which is not always the case with happiness in a marriage. The ending came from Claire rather than from me, which is the part that organized the first year of aftermath. She had arrived at a conclusion about the marriage that I had not been approaching, from a direction I had not been looking in, and the conclusion was that the marriage had been genuinely happy in the ways I have described and had also been, across the 15 years, missing something she had not been able to name early enough to address and had finally named too late to repair. She told me what she had finally named in a conversation that I have gone over many times since, and that I understood less clearly on the day of it than I understand now. What she named was the specific experience of being with someone who was genuinely happy with her without being genuinely curious about her. But the happiness had not required curiosity. I had known what I needed to know to be happy with Claire, and I had been happy with what I knew, and had not been regularly or actively extending my knowing. She had not felt unloved. She had felt known to a depth that had been established early, and had not been expanded across the 15 years. And the depth had been sufficient for my happiness and insufficient for hers. And the insufficiency had been building across the 15 years, without a clear moment she could have pointed to as the crisis. I received this with the specific quality of someone hearing something that is simultaneously new information and, on reflection, recognizable. The recognizable quality was what I stayed with. The specific memory of having not asked questions I could have asked, of having been satisfied with the version of Claire I had, rather than actively interested in the version she was continuing to become. I had loved her without being curious about her in the way that the loving should have produced curiosity, and the absence of the curiosity had been invisible to me, because it is not a negative act. It is an absence rather than a commission, which makes it harder to see from the inside. I spent the year after the marriage examining the absence and what it had been in the 15 years, and what it indicated about how I had been inside the marriage and inside prior relationships and inside the general project of knowing another person. What the examination produced was a recognition of a habit I had not known I had, which was the habit of arriving at a sufficient knowledge of someone I loved, and then living inside the sufficiency without continuing to extend the knowing. But the sufficiency was enough for my happiness, and it had not been enough for Claire's, and the gap between those two thresholds was the thing the 15 years had accumulated without my seeing it accumulate. I am more curious now than I was during the marriage, not as a performed change, but as the genuine outcome of understanding what the absence had cost and wanting the cost to inform how I move forward. The curiosity is still a practice rather than a natural state. I notice when I am settling into sufficiency with someone I am close to, and I extend past the noticing rather than settling, and the extending requires effort that it did not used to require because the habit was in the other direction for a long time. The effort is worth it. It was worth it before I understood that, which is the specific irony of all the things that are worth doing that we do not do until we understand why they are worth it. The absence of curiosity rather than a presence of something harmful is the specific shape of the injury in this story, which places it in a different register from most of the others tonight. Claire not feeling unloved but feeling known to an established depth that had stopped being extended is a precise and recognizable description of something that happens in long marriages, without either person intending it or noticing it from the inside. The narrator's recognition of the habit being the outcome of the examination, rather than to the beginning of it, is the right structure. The examination produced the recognition, rather than the recognition prompting the examination. Someone spent 9 years married to a person who was, by the assessment of everyone who knew them, the more emotionally expressive of the two, and discovered in the aftermath of the divorce that the expressiveness had been functioning as a kind of weather system that had made her own interior permanently secondary, without either of them designing it that way. Her husband's name was Leon, and he was the kind of person whose emotional life was large and visible and present in the room in a way that she had found, at the beginning of the marriage, genuinely compelling. He felt things fully and expressed them with the specific unself-consciousness of someone who has never been told that the scale of their interior is a problem. His grief was present grief. His joy was present joy. His frustration arrived in the room before he did, and his enthusiasm had a quality that organized the people around him, around itself. She had loved this about him, and she had loved being in the orbit of it, and she had not examined what being in the orbit of it cost in terms of the orbit's effect on her own gravitational field. The examination arrived in therapy in year 7, her own therapy, entered for reasons that were professional rather than marital, and that became, across the course of it, increasingly marital in the way that good therapy tends to expand toward the actual subject. The therapist asked questions about what she brought into conversations at home, and she answered them honestly, and the answers, assembled across several months of sessions, had a direction. She brought context. She brought support. She brought the specific attunement of someone who had learned to read another person's emotional weather with precision, and who had organized her own responses around what the reading produced. She brought very little of her own interior into the conversations because the conversations had, across 9 years, found their shape around Leon's interior, and the shape was established and comfortable, and her own interior did not fit easily into the established shape. She did not immediately bring this to Leon. She sat with it in therapy for several months because she wanted to understand it well enough to describe it without the description becoming an accusation, which it was not intended to be. The dynamic had not been designed. Leon had not constructed a marriage in which her interior was secondary. He had simply been who he was, with the large and visible emotional life he had, and the marriage had organized itself around the largest available gravitational pull in the way that things organize themselves around the largest available gravitational pull. She had participated in the organizing without examining the cost of the participation. When she brought it to Leon, he received it with something she had not expected, which was immediate recognition. He said he had noticed, over the years, that she rarely told him how she was in any depth, and that he had attributed the rarity to her nature. He had understood her as someone who processed things privately, and did not need the same external expression that he needed. He said he had not known how to ask without the asking feeling like a demand for a kind of expression that might not be hers. She said the rarity was not her nature. It was the accommodation of a marriage whose shape had not made her interior easy to introduce. They worked on it, 2 years of working on it, therapy together, and conversations that were organized differently from the conversations that had preceded them, with her interior as the deliberate starting point, rather than the thing that fit in around the edges of his. The 2 years produced genuine change, and did not produce enough change for the marriage to survive, which was not because Leon failed to try. He tried with the genuine effort of someone who understood for the first time what he had been inadvertently producing and was alarmed by the understanding. The 9 years had built a shape, and the shape had its own inertia, and 2 years of different conversations was not sufficient to replace the inertia with something new. She is not angry at Leon. She is not entirely not angry at the 9 years, which she processes as both genuinely hers and as years in which something that should have been present was not. She is working on introducing her interior into the relationship she is in now, with the deliberateness that she did not bring to the 9 years, which is harder than it sounds for someone whose 9 years trained her away from it and whose therapy is still in the process of training her back. The weather system, as the metaphor for Leon's emotional life, is not the narrator's metaphor. It is the accurate description of what a large and consistently expressed interior does to the shared atmosphere of a marriage, which is that it becomes the climate rather than one of the weather patterns. The 2 years of working on it, producing genuine change without sufficient change, is the honest accounting of what inertia in a 9-year dynamic costs when you try to reverse it in 2. Not a failure of effort, but a failure of time, which is a different kind of problem and one that does not resolve cleanly into fault. The next one comes from someone who discovered that the reason his marriage had ended was something he had been doing for so long and so unconsciously that he had not had a name for it until his ex-wife gave him one in the final conversation of their 12 years together. Her name was Rosalind, and the final conversation was not a fight. I want to establish that because the category of final conversation in a marriage tends to produce an expectation of combat, and this one was not that. And it was the kind of conversation that two people have when they have already arrived at the conclusion and are now in the specific period of naming what produced it, which is a different kind of difficulty from the conflict that the conclusion might have followed. We had been through the conflict period. The final conversation was the accounting period, and the accounting is where she gave me the name. And the name she gave me was for something I had been doing across the 12 years that she had experienced as a specific and consistent pattern, and that I had experienced as simply the way I navigated disagreement. When we disagreed about something, and the something could be anything, from the significant decisions of a shared life to the minor negotiations of a Tuesday evening, I had a specific way of responding to the disagreement that involved a series of moves so practiced and so automatic that I had not known I was making them. I would begin by acknowledging her position. I would then offer a version of it back to her that was slightly different from the version she had offered, in a direction that moved the position closer to mine. I would invite her to consider whether my version of her position was not, in fact, what she had meant. And I would do this with a calm and a reasonableness that made the whole operation feel like genuine engagement rather than what it was, which was the systematic and unconscious replacement of her position, with a version of it that required less of me to accommodate. She had been experiencing this across 12 years, without having the name for it until a therapist she had been seeing for the final 2 years of the marriage had given her the name. The name is a word that exists in psychological literature and that I am going to describe rather than use because the using of it tends to produce defensiveness in the person being named, and I am trying to describe what it actually was rather than produce a reaction to its label. What it was a specific and sustained pattern of appearing to engage with another person's position while actually redirecting it. which has the effect of making the other person feel both heard and gradually disappeared, which is its own specific kind of harm. She described it to me in the final conversation with a specificity that I received in real time with the same move I had been making for 12 years. I found myself beginning to acknowledge her description and then offering back a version of it that was slightly different in a direction that made it less about me. I caught myself doing it in the middle of doing it, which had not happened before because the naming had created an observational position I had not previously had access to. I stopped, I sat with what I had been about to do, and I said out loud that I had just started doing the thing she had described while she was describing it. Rosalind said yes, she said she knew. She said she had watched me start and catch myself, and that the catching was the most honest thing she had seen me do in a long time, and that she was glad it had happened, even though it was happening in the final conversation, rather than in one of the 12 years' worth of conversations that had preceded it. I have spent the 2 years since the final conversation, learning to recognize the move as I begin to make it, rather than after I have made it. The recognition has become faster with practice, and is still not immediate, and I'm not certain it will become immediate, because the move was practiced for long enough that its automation is real, rather than occasional. What the recognition produces when I catch it is a moment of choice that the automation was preventing. The choice of whether to redirect, or to stay in the discomfort of genuine engagement with a position that requires something from me. I am choosing genuine engagement more often than I was. I am not choosing it every time. The not every time is honest rather than discouraging, which is how I'm trying to hold it. The catching himself in the middle of doing the thing while she's describing the thing is the specific moment the story turns on, and the fact that it happened in the final conversation rather than the 12 years worth of conversations before. It is the specific tragedy and the specific gift simultaneously. Too late for the marriage, early enough for what comes after. Rosalind's response to the catching, glad it happened even in the final conversation, is the grace note that makes this a story about something other than loss. Here's one that arrives from a specific and unusual angle, someone who had been married twice and discovered, in the aftermath of the second marriage ending, that both marriages had ended for the same reason, and that the reason was something they had carried between them. And the first marriage was to a woman named Sarah and lasted 6 years. The second marriage was to a woman named Diana and lasted 9 years. The endings were separated by 3 years and were, into the narratives I had constructed about them, different in their causes. The first ending the result of specific circumstances that had felt particular to that marriage. The second ending the result of different specific circumstances that had felt particular to that marriage. I had held the two endings as separate and distinct, and had not examined them as a pair, until a conversation with a therapist in year 2 of the post-Diana life produced a question I had not been asked before. The therapist asked me to describe the moment in each marriage where I had felt most alone. Not the moment of greatest conflict or greatest pain, the moment of greatest aloneness, which is a different question and produces a different kind of answer. I described the moment in the first marriage. Then I described the moment in the second marriage. The therapist asked me what the two moments had in common. I sat with the question for a long time in the session and for longer outside it. The two moments were in different marriages with different people in different circumstances and different years of my life. And what they had in common was not the circumstances or the people or the years. What they had in common was me, specifically what I had been doing in both moments, which was the same thing, which was withdrawing. Not dramatically, not in a way that either Sarah or Diana would have described as withdrawal if you had asked them at the time. A specific and private internal withdrawal. The retraction of a part of myself that I moved out of reach when the marriage asked something of me that I did not know how to give. And the thing the marriage was asking in both moments was the same thing. A kind of emotional availability that required me to be uncertain in front of another person, and to remain in that uncertainty rather than resolving it quickly into something more manageable. I could not do it with Sarah, and I had not been able to do it with Diana, and the inability had produced, in both marriages, the same outcome: a partner who could feel the withdrawal without being able to name it, who had organized their experience of the marriage around a presence that was intermittently retracted without apparent cause, and who had arrived at the ending of the marriage with a specific and accurate sense that they had not fully had me, even in the periods when I appeared to be most present. The recognition produced something that the two separate narratives had not produced, which was a single account of something I had been carrying through both marriages without examining it. The single account was uncomfortable to hold as mine. It was easier to hold two separate accounts organized around the specific circumstances of each ending, which distributed the cause across the marriages rather than locating it in me. The single account located it in me. The location was accurate and was the beginning of the work that the two separate accounts had been preventing. I am not married a third time. I am in a relationship that is serious and that is asking me the question that both marriages asked, and that I am, with significant effort, answering differently than I answered it in either of the marriages. The answering differently is not a natural state for me. It is a daily practice of choosing not to withdraw when the withdrawal presents itself as an option, which it does regularly and with the familiarity of a long-established habit. I have not resolved the habit, and I am in conversation with it, which is different from resolution and more honest about what working on something deeply established actually looks like. The therapist's question, the moment of greatest aloneness rather than greatest pain, is the specific question that produces the discovery this story is organized around. And the difference between those two questions is the methodological thing this story is actually about. Aloneness and pain are not the same question and do not produce the same answer. And the answer to the aloneness question assembled the pattern across two marriages that the answer to the pain question had been keeping separate. The daily practice of choosing not to withdraw, being different from resolution, is the right description of what working on something deeply habitual actually is, which is ongoing rather than concluded. This last one for the chunk is from someone who was married for 20 years and who discovered at the end of the 20th year that the person she had been for the duration of the marriage was not the person she had been before it, and that the marriage, in producing the person she had been during it, had replaced someone she had not known she missed until the replacement was over. Her name as a married person was a version of herself that she can describe with specificity: organized, careful, the person who maintained the household and the calendar and the relationships and the specific administrative life of a family, with 2 children and a husband whose professional life required significant support. She had done these things well. She had found genuine satisfaction in the doing of them, or she had found something she had understood as genuine satisfaction, and that she is now less certain was satisfaction as opposed to the specific reward of competence, which is a real reward and is not the same thing as satisfaction. The person she had been before the marriage was different in ways she had understood during the marriage as ways she had grown past. She had been less organized and more spontaneous. She had had a specific appetite for uncertainty that the marriage's structure had gradually replaced with the competence of someone who managed uncertainty rather than inhabited it. She had made decisions quickly and often badly, and had found the badness of the decisions instructive in a way that the careful decision-making of the marriage years had not been instructive. Because careful decisions protect you from the feedback that bad decisions provide. Her husband's name was Michael, and the ending of the marriage was something they had both arrived at, rather than something one of them had done to the other, and the arriving had taken several years, and had been conducted with the care that 20 years of shared life and 2 children require when the care is genuine rather than performed. She does not blame the marriage for the replacement of the pre-marriage person. The replacement had been a mutual and largely voluntary process of becoming the person the marriage needed. She does not blame Michael. She holds the replacement as something that happened in the marriage rather than something the marriage did to her, which is a distinction she has found necessary to maintain for the accuracy of her own accounting. What she found in the years after the divorce was the person she had been before, not restored to the original version, but available in a form that had been shaped by 20 years of the replaced version, and was therefore a synthesis rather than a restoration. The spontaneity was available, but was now in conversation with the organizational competence, rather than in the absence of it. The appetite for uncertainty had returned, and was navigated with 20 years of adult experience that the pre-marriage version had not had. The bad decisions were still possible, and were now more often chosen deliberately rather than by default, which is a different relationship to the badness, and a more interesting one. The synthesis is not something she would have designed or sought through the divorce, which was grieved in the way that 20 years requires grief, and which produced the synthesis as a byproduct rather than as a goal. She is more herself, she says, which is a statement that requires the clarification she provides. More herself in the sense of the self that existed before the marriage shaped it into the marriage's person, available in a form that the intervening years have changed rather than erased. The marriage produced someone, the divorce recovered someone. The person who is living into the years after the divorce contains both, which is not a resolution so much as a carrying of the full account. The synthesis rather than restoration is the concept this story earns at its conclusion. Not a return to the pre-marriage self, but an integration of the pre-marriage self with the person the marriage produced, which is more accurate to what the years actually do to a person than the simpler version of either loss or recovery. The bad decisions being chosen deliberately rather than by default is the specific image that carries the synthesis most precisely. Not the absence of the organizational competence, but its presence alongside the spontaneity, which is a more complete version than either the marriage or the pre-marriage period contained alone. Someone spent 16 years in a marriage that ended quietly and discovered in the quiet of the ending that the thing she had believed was the marriage's greatest strength had been, for most of the 16 years, its most significant liability. The strength she had believed in was the absence of conflict. Marcus and she did not fight. Not in the early years when most couples fight as they learn each other's edges, and not in the middle years when the accumulated pressures of careers and children and financial decisions produce the friction that most marriages navigate through argument. They had found early a way of being together that routed around conflict, rather than moving through it. And she had understood the rooting as evidence of compatibility, as the sign of two people who were so well suited to each other that the friction other couples experienced was simply not a feature of what they had. The rooting had worked through a specific mechanism that she did not understand until year 14, which was that each of them had, in the early years of the marriage, learned with precision what the other person would not accept and had organized their behavior around the not accepting rather than testing it. Marcus did not bring things that would produce her discomfort. She did not bring things that would produce his. The organization had been mutual and unconscious and had produced, across 16 years, a marriage that looked like harmony from the outside and was, from the inside, two people who had stopped bringing the full version of themselves into the shared space, because the full version had edges that the rooting did not accommodate. She understood this in year 14 through the specific experience of having something she needed to say, and finding that the architecture of the marriage had no channel for it, and not something dramatic, a feeling about a decision they were making together that was different from the feeling she had been expressing to Marcus, and that she had been expressing differently because the different version was closer to the version the marriage's architecture had space for. Not she held the unexpressed version and examined it and found that the holding was familiar, that she had been holding versions of this for years and routing them into the expressible version, and not noticing the routing because it had been so long practiced that it felt like the version rather than a redaction of it. She brought this to a therapist rather than to Marcus initially, which was the right order. She needed to understand what she was describing before she could describe it to the person it was about. The therapy produced a map of the routing, which was more extensive than she had understood, which covered more territory in the marriage than she had realized the routing had colonized. The map took several months to draw and was at its completion not the most uncomfortable document she had produced in the marriage, because it showed her that the harmony she had valued was built on a systematic avoidance of the friction she had understood as absence of incompatibility. She brought the map to Marcus in year 15. He received it with the specific quality of someone recognizing a description of something they had participated in without having examined it. He confirmed the routing from his side. He had his own version of the map, indifferently shaped but covering similar territory. They had both been doing it. The marriage's harmony had been produced by two people who had been routed around each other for years in a mutual agreement that neither of them had explicitly made. They worked on it in year 15 and 16 with genuine effort and with the specific difficulty of two people who have no established muscle for the thing they are now trying to do. Direct conflict, when they attempted it, felt disproportionate and alarming. The routing had made the unrouted version feel like a crisis because they had no experience of it resolving without damage. The damage, when it came, was more manageable than the alarm had suggested it would be, and the managing produced something neither of them had known was available, which was the experience of disagreeing inside a marriage and surviving the disagreement. The survival came too late. The repair was real, and the effort was genuine, and the 16 years of rooting had produced a distance between who they each actually were and who the marriage's architecture had allowed them to be. That 2 years of direct conflict could not fully close. The ending was as quiet as the marriage had been, and was, in its quietness, the final expression of a dynamic they had spent 2 years trying to undo, and had not fully undone. She does not think of the 16 years as wasted. She thinks of them as years organized around a value, harmony, that turned out to require the wrong kind of sacrifice to maintain. The sacrifice had been real, and the harmony had been real, and the two things had been trading off against each other across 16 years without her understanding the trade, until year 14. The understanding came late and produced something even in its lateness. Not the marriage's survival, but the specific knowledge that she carries into every relationship, sense of what harmony that requires no one to be routed around actually feels like, which she knows now because she has learned what its absence was. The rooting mechanism is the specific contribution this story makes to tonight's collection. The active and unconscious process by which two people protect a marriage from conflict by organizing around each other's edges, rather than bringing the full version of themselves into contact with each other. The harmony being real, and the rooting producing it, and the two being in the specific relationship of trade-off rather than coexistence, is the structure that requires the most careful accounting, because it refuses the simple verdict of either the harmony was false or the rooting was deliberate. This one is from someone who spent 7 years in a marriage and discovered through the ending that they had been bringing to the marriage exactly what the marriage required and had not been bringing what the marriage needed, and that the difference between those two things had been invisible to them for all 7 years. His name was David, and the marriage was to a woman named Claire, who had told him in the conversation that ended the 7 years, something that had required her, she said, years of working up to say. She said he had always given the marriage what he had understood it to require: the logistics, the consideration, the practical care of a person who took their commitments seriously, and that she had received these things and had valued them, and that they had not been enough, because what the marriage had needed was something different from what it required. and she had not been certain he knew the difference. He did not know the difference. B. He received the sentence, and he understood the words individually, and he did not understand what she was describing as a distinction that had been operative in his life. The marriage requiring something, and the marriage needing something. These had been, in his understanding of the marriage, the same category. You identified what was required, and you provided it, and the providing was the fulfillment of the need. Also, the possibility that the marriage could be fully supplied in its requirements and still be in deficit in its needs was not a possibility he had been operating with. Claire tried to explain the distinction in the conversation and succeeded partially, which was enough for him to understand that the distinction was real, and not enough for him to understand what it meant for how he had been inside the marriage. The fuller understanding came across the year after the ending, through the specific process of examining the 7 years from the outside and finding, in the examination, the evidence of the distinction that the inside had not provided. The evidence assembled around a specific type of occasion. The occasions when Claire had been in distress and had brought the distress to him. He had, in those occasions, consistently and competently addressed the source of the distress, and he had identified what was required, and he had provided it. Practical solutions, concrete support, the resolution of the distressing circumstance where the resolution was available. What he had not done was remain in the distress with Claire before resolving it, which was what the distress had been asking for, before it was asking for resolution. The marriage had needed him to be present in the difficulty before being effective about it, and he had moved to effectiveness as quickly as effectiveness was available, because presence in difficulty without moving toward resolution had felt, to him, like a failure of the competence that the marriage required. The distinction between presence and effectiveness was the map of the 7 years, once he had the distinction to apply to the map. He had been highly effective and intermittently present, and the intermittent presence had been invisible to him, because the effectiveness had been so consistent that it had covered the intervals. Claire had felt the intervals. She had not felt abandoned. He had been too effective for abandonment to be the description. She had felt attended to by someone who was solving the circumstances of her life with genuine care, and who was not quite available in the way that someone who stays in the difficulty with you is available. He is a different person in the relationship he is in now than he was in the 7 years. Not through the management of the old habit, but through the genuine shift that comes from understanding something accurately enough that the behavior it was producing is no longer available as a default. The default now is to stay before solving, which runs against a strong orientation and requires something of him that the 7 years did not require, because the 7 years accepted the effectiveness as sufficient. The current relationship does not accept it as sufficient. He does not accept it as sufficient. The insufficiency of effectiveness without presence is the specific thing he carries from the 7 years that he did not carry into them. Presence and effectiveness as distinct categories rather than a spectrum of the same thing is the conceptual work this story does that earns its place alongside the others tonight. The evidence of the distinction assembling around a specific type of occasion, the distress occasions, is the right location for the evidence to be found, because distress is where the difference between staying in the difficulty and solving the difficulty is most legible. Claire not feeling abandoned because the effectiveness was too consistent is the precise articulation of what made the distinction invisible to him. You cannot see a deficit when the adjacent competence is covering it. Here's one from someone whose divorce was, by every external measure, clean and mutual, and conducted with dignity, and who found in the aftermath that clean and mutual and dignified divorces have a specific cost that less clean ones do not. Her name was Philippa, and she and her husband, whose name was Richard, had done everything correctly. They had gone to mediation rather than litigation. They had divided the assets equitably and with genuine goodwill toward each other. They had maintained a co-parenting relationship that was functional and in many moments genuinely warm. The people in their lives had said they were handling it remarkably well, and they had both received the remark with a specific mixture of pride and exhaustion that handling something remarkably well produces in the people who are doing the handling. The cost of the remarkable handling was this: the divorce had been handled so well that there was no residue of it available as proof of its significance. The clean and mutual and dignified ending had produced a conclusion that looked, from the outside and sometimes from the inside, like the conclusion of something that had not been particularly significant, which was not accurate. The marriage had been significant. The ending of it was significant. The significance had been absorbed into the handling, and the handling had converted the significance into something that looked like a well-managed transition rather than the end of something that had mattered enormously. She found this in the first year after the divorce, in the specific experience of not being able to grieve fully in any context that included other people. The grief required a scale of expression that the remarkable handling had not left room for. To grieve visibly and fully would have been to reveal that what had been handled so well had actually cost something that the handling had not fully acknowledged. That the people who had told her she was handling it remarkably well had been told a version of events in which the handling was the story, and the handling had been so complete that the cost of what was being handled had been obscured by the competence of the handling. She was also, she understood, protecting Richard from the full expression of her grief, which was a continuation of the goodwill that the remarkable handling had required, and which had its own specific cost. If she had grieved fully and visibly, she would have been communicating to Richard that the thing they had ended together had cost her in ways that the clean conclusion had not acknowledged, and the communication might have cost him something, and the protection of him from the cost was a reflex. She could not fully disable, even once the marriage had ended. The therapy she entered in month 4 of the first year was the first context in which the full scale of the grief had room. The therapist was the first person to whom she could say how significant the marriage had been, and how significant the ending was, without the saying being in conflict with the story that the remarkable handling had established. The conflict between the handling story and the grief story was the specific thing the therapy was required to hold, and the holding produced, across the first year, a grief that was proportionate to what had actually ended, rather than to what the handling had suggested had ended. She and Richard are still good co-parents. The warmth in that context is real, and is not the whole story. The whole story includes the year of grief that the handling had deferred, and that the therapy had provided the first adequate container for. The whole story is held by her now with a completeness that the remarkable handling had not permitted. And the completeness is better than the handling's version, even though the handling's version was what the circumstances required and what she would do again in the same circumstances. Both of those things are true simultaneously, and she has stopped trying to resolve the simultaneous quality into a verdict. The specific cost of clean, dignified divorces, being the obscuring of the significance of what was ended, is the observation this story makes that most divorce narratives cannot make, because most divorce narratives are organized around the conflict, rather than its absence. The grief requiring a scale of expression that the remarkable handling had not left room for is the precise mechanism of the cost. The handling had been so complete that it had consumed the space the grief needed, and the grief had been deferred into a year of therapy, rather than expressed in the months when it was most acute. The continuation of the co-parenting goodwill protection reflex past the end of the marriage is the detail that makes Philippa's situation most specifically hers. This one arrives from a man who was married for 23 years and who found, in the process of emptying the house after the divorce, a collection of objects that assembled as he encountered them, and into the most accurate portrait of his marriage he had ever seen. The house had been their house for 17 of the 23 years, and the emptying of it was the final practical act of the divorce, which had been finalized 8 months before, but had left the house in a shared liminal state while the logistics resolved. He was emptying it alone because his ex-wife, whose name was Helen, had already taken what she was taking and had left the rest to him to manage. And the rest was more than he had expected, and the managing took 3 days, rather than the single day he had budgeted for it. The objects he encountered across the 3 days were the ordinary accumulated objects of a long marriage in a long occupied house. The things that arrive and are placed somewhere and are not moved again because they have found their location, and the location has been accepted by the household as where that thing lives. What he found in the encountering was that the objects, taken individually, were simply objects, and that the objects, encountered in sequence across 3 days of emptying an occupied house, assembled into a portrait he had not been looking for, and could not stop assembling once he had started. The first object that produced this quality was a photograph he found in a drawer he had not opened in years. A photograph of Helen in the first year of their marriage, before children, and before the specific settling of a long shared life, with a quality in her face that he had forgotten the marriage had once regularly produced. He sat with the photograph for a long time, and then placed it in the box of things he was taking with him. The second was a piece of paper he found in a different drawer, a list in Helen's handwriting from approximately 15 years earlier, a list of things she had wanted to do that she had apparently made as a private accounting of her own desires, rather than as a shared list of plans. Several of the things on the list were things they had done together across the 15 years. Several were things they had not done, and that he had not known she had wanted. The proportion between the done and the not done on the private list was a piece of information about the marriage that the marriage had not produced. The third was a small object that had been in the same location in the house for the entire 17 years, placed there in the first weeks of occupying the house, and never moved, so thoroughly incorporated into the background of the house that he had stopped seeing it years ago. It was an object Helen had brought from before the marriage, from the life she had been living before they met, and finding it in the emptying was a specific experience of encountering something that had been present throughout the marriage, and had been invisible to him through the entirety of its presence. He finished the emptying across the 3 days, and drove away from the house with the boxes and the photograph, and the knowledge of the private list, and the small object from Helen's pre-marriage life. And he sat in the parking lot of the storage facility, where he was taking the boxes, and understood that the 3 days had been the most complete account of the marriage he had ever had access to. Not because the objects contained information he had not had. They did not, individually, because the sequential encountering of them across 3 days of emptying had produced a reading of the marriage that the living of the marriage had not produced, which is the specific thing that the ending of something provides, that the continuation of it does not. You can see the shape of a thing once you are outside it in a way that being inside it prevents. The private list is the image that carries the most weight in the story, because it is not an object of the marriage, but an object from inside Helen's own interiority, that the marriage had been alongside rather than fully inside, and the proportion of done to not done on the list is information that the marriage had not provided, and that the emptying of the house had made visible. In the 3-day reading of a 23-year marriage, through its accumulated objects, is the right scale for what the ending of a long marriage requires to be understood. Not a conversation, not a document, but the sequential encountering of what was left behind. Someone spent 14 years married to a person who was, by their own assessment and by the assessment of everyone who knew them, the more capable partner, and discovered in the years after the divorce that the capability had been doing something to both of them that the marriage had never examined. Her husband's name was Greg, and the capability was real, and the way that some people's capabilities are real. Not performed competence, not the management of appearance, but the genuine and consistent ability to navigate whatever the situation produced with a fluency that made him the person the household organized itself around when the situation required navigation. financial decisions, practical crises, the ordinary logistics of a life with 2 children and 2 careers, and the 100 small decisions that shared lives require. Greg handled them with a completeness that she had valued and had relied on and had understood inside the marriage as his contribution to the shared architecture. What she understood in the years after the divorce was that the reliance had done something to her that the marriage had not examined because the marriage had not required the examination. She had become, across 14 years of Greg's capability, someone who deferred to the capable person in the room when the capable person was available, which inside the marriage had meant deferring to Greg, which had meant not developing the specific muscles that the situations Greg handled would have developed in her if she had been required to handle them. She had contributed in other dimensions of the marriage. She had not contributed in the dimension the capability had occupied, and the not contributing had left that dimension undeveloped in her, in ways she was only discovering now that the capability was no longer present. She does not describe this as Greg's fault. The deference had been mutual, in the sense that Greg had not required her to defer. He had simply been capable, and she had deferred because the deference was easier than developing the capability herself, and Greg had not examined the cost of the deference to her, because the arrangement had worked for the marriage, and the working had been sufficient for his examination to stop. 2 people in an arrangement that works have limited incentive to examine the cost of the arrangement's working unless the cost becomes visible, and inside the marriage the cost had not been visible because her undeveloped capabilities were not required by a marriage that contained Greg's developed ones. In the years after the divorce, the undeveloped capabilities were required by a life that no longer contained Greg. The requiring was uncomfortable in the specific way of being asked to use muscles that have not been exercised. Not impossible, not shameful, but effortful in a way that the same capabilities in someone who had been using them for 14 years would not have been effortful. She developed them, not quickly and not without the specific embarrassment of a capable adult, learning things that she felt she should have already known, but genuinely across the years of the post-divorce life, until the capabilities that the marriage had not required were hers, in the same way that the ones the marriage had required were hers. The thing she finds most worth examining in the years since is not the underdevelopment itself. That is simply what the arrangement produced, and the production was not designed. What she finds most worth examining is the specific quality of the marriage and the dimension the capability had occupied, which was a quality of passive receipt that she had understood as partnership, and that was, she now sees, something more like spectatorship in a domain that had been organized around Greg's capability rather than built mutually between them. The domain had been his. She had benefited from it without being inside it, which is a different relationship to a shared domain than the one that genuine partnership requires. Greg has his own accounting to do with what the capability cost him. The specific weight of being the capable person in a marriage, the way that capability attracts reliance, and how reliance shapes the capable person over 14 years in ways that are not always what the capable person would have chosen if the choosing had been examined, rather than simply accumulated. She does not know what his accounting contains. That is his. The 2-direction cost of the capability arrangement is what makes this story's specific contribution to tonight's collection not only what the reliance did to her, but the acknowledgement that the capability had its own cost for Greg that the marriage had equally not examined. The passive receipt being understood as partnership from inside the arrangement and visible as spectatorship from outside. It is the reframe that the post-divorce years produce, and the distinction between benefiting from a domain and being inside it is the most precise formulation of what genuine partnership in a shared life actually requires. The next one is from someone who discovered at the end of a 10-year marriage that the story of who had ended the marriage, a story she had told and been told, was more complicated than the told version in a direction that required her to revise her understanding of her own agency in what had happened, and the told version was that he had ended it. Daniel had been the one who had said the words, who had initiated the final conversation, who had named the thing that neither of them had been naming for the year before the naming. The told version was accurate in this specific sense. He had said the words first. What the told version omitted was the year before the words in which she had been behaving, without fully examining the behavior, and in a way that had made the ending more likely rather than less. The omission was not deliberate. She had not been examining the year because the year had been a year of genuine and significant difficulty for her. Professional and personal circumstances that had required most of her available attention, and that had produced, as a byproduct of the requirement, a withdrawal from the marriage that she had not identified as a withdrawal, because she had been inside the difficulty, and the withdrawal had felt like the ordinary reduction of available energy, rather than a directional movement away from the marriage. The withdrawal had been directional. She understood this in therapy in the year after the divorce. In the process of describing the year before Daniel's words, Ethan, and hearing the description in a room where someone was listening to it without the investment in the narrative that the told version required. The therapist did not ask her to revise the told version. The therapist simply asked questions whose answers assembled, over the course of several sessions, into a picture of the year that had a direction the told version did not include. The direction was toward an exit she had not consciously been planning, and had been, below the conscious level, a moving toward. The difficulty of the year had not produced the withdrawal. The difficulty had provided the cover for a withdrawal, whose source was something she had not examined about the marriage itself, something she had been not examining for longer than the year, and that the difficulty had finally given her the unconscious permission to act on without naming. Daniel had named it first because he had been watching the withdrawal, without the cover that the difficulty had provided her for the watching. And the naming had been accurate, even if the naming had made him the one who ended it in the told version. She brought this to Daniel in a conversation that happened 18 months after the divorce, which was the time she needed to arrive at the understanding, and the additional time she needed to decide that he deserved to know it. As she told him, she had come to understand that the told version was incomplete, and that the incomplete version had given him the role of the ender in a story where her own role had been more active than the told version captured. He was quiet for a long time, and then said he had known. He said he had watched the year, and had known what the withdrawal was about, even without her naming it, and that the naming he had done had been as much a response to what he was watching as it had been an initiation of the ending. The conversation produced a revision of the told version that neither of them had available when the divorce was happening, and that both of them found 18 months later, more accurate and more workable than the told version had been. Not a reconciliation, an honesty that the divorce had not been able to produce while the divorce was occurring, which arrived late and was still worth arriving. The unconscious exit being covered by the conscious difficulty is the specific mechanism this story names, that most accounts of marriage endings cannot name, because it requires the narrator to implicate themselves in an ending they had been casting as something that happened to them, rather than something they participated in producing. And the 18-month delay between understanding and telling being necessary for both the understanding and the courage is the honest accounting of the sequence. And Daniel's response, that he had known, being delivered without resentment, is the grace that makes the late honesty land as something other than a further injury. This one arrives from someone who spent 12 years in a marriage and found, in the specific silence of the first months after the ending, something she had not known the marriage had been preventing her from hearing. The silence was literal initially. The house she had moved into after the divorce was her own, in a way the marital home had not been, which meant it was organized around her rhythms rather than the shared rhythms of a marriage. And the shared rhythms had included a consistent ambient noise that she had understood as the ordinary sound of a shared life, and that was now absent. The absence of the ambient noise was uncomfortable in the first weeks, and resolved, across the following months, into something she had not expected, which was that the silence had a quality she had not encountered in 12 years. Her husband's name was Evan, and the quality of his presence in the house had been, across the 12 years, a kind of constant social calibration that she had been performing without knowing she was performing it, on not the conscious social effort of someone actively managing a relationship. The automatic and below conscious process of being in the same space as another person and continuously adjusting your own behavior in response to theirs. She had been adjusting to Evan's presence, moods, needs, and communications for 12 years, in a way so automatic it had become the background of her experience rather than the foreground. The background had been the entire field, which she did not understand till the field was empty. The silence of the first months produced, gradually and then all at once, access to something that had been below the social calibration. She began to notice her own preferences in a register she had not been able to access inside the marriage. Not the preferences she had been expressing to Evan or negotiating within the marriage, but preferences that existed below the level of expression and negotiation, in the stratum of interior life that the constant social calibration had been covering. What she liked to do on a Sunday morning when nobody else's Sunday morning was adjacent to hers. What she thought about things when the thinking was not a preamble to discussion or a response to someone else's position. What she wanted the physical space around her to feel like when the feeling was entirely her own. The access to this stratum was not comfortable immediately. The below calibration preferences were unfamiliar in the way that things are unfamiliar when you have not had access to them for a long time, and the unfamiliarity was accompanied by a specific grief for the 12 years in which this stratum had been covered. Not because Evan had covered it deliberately, but because the covering had been the natural product of sustained cohabitation with another person, and the 12 years had been inside the covering without her knowing. There was a stratum beneath it, to be covered. She brought this understanding to bear on the marriage not as a retrospective accusation, but as an honest account of what the marriage had contained that she had not examined. The marriage had been good in the way she had understood it to be good. She is not revising the goodness. What it had also been was the constant company of another person's presence, which had produced the constant social calibration, which had covered the below calibration stratum for 12 years. And the stratum had been waiting with patience for a condition that allowed it to be audible. The stratum is audible now. It is 2 years into the silence of the house that is entirely hers. The most interesting thing she has found in the aftermath of the marriage. Not a revelation, not a dramatic self-discovery, but the gradual and ongoing encounter with the preferences and the interior that the 12 years had not produced access to. She is not lonely in the house. She is the most specific and unmediated version of herself that she has been in 12 years. And the specificity has a quality that she is still learning to recognize as simply her own. The below calibration stratum is the concept this story adds to tonight's collection. The layer of interior life that the constant social adjustment of cohabitation covers in a way that is not deliberate and not harmful, but is complete enough that the covering is only legible once the cohabitation has ended. The 12 years not producing access to it, not as failure, but as the natural condition of sustained shared life, is the honest framing that keeps this from being a story about a bad marriage, which it is not. It is a story about what constant company does to the stratum beneath company, and what the stratum reveals when the company is finally absent. This last one for the chunk comes from someone who was married for 19 years, and who found, at the end of those years, in Anamavamins, that the grief he was carrying was not only for the marriage, but for a version of the future that he had been building toward for so long that the building had become indistinguishable from the life itself. Her name was Margot, and 19 years is long enough that the plans you make inside a marriage are not separate from the life of the marriage, but are the life. They are the texture of the future that the present is moving toward, and the shared orientation of two people who have aligned their expectations and their resources around a direction that is jointly held. They had plans. The plans were specific. and had been refined across many years of conversation, an adjustment, and renewed commitment to the direction the plans required. The plans were about a particular way of living in the next chapter of their lives, a chapter that was close enough to be concrete rather than abstract, that had details rather than outlines, that had the quality of something being actively constructed rather than merely imagined. The divorce dissolved the plans along with the marriage, which he had anticipated in the intellectual sense and had not anticipated in the experiential sense. Anticipating the dissolution of plans and experiencing the dissolution of plans are different categories of engagement with the same event, and the experience had a quality the anticipation had not prepared him for. The plans had not been background to the marriage. They had been the foreground of its most recent years, the thing the present was being organized around, and the loss of them was not separable from the loss of the present they had been organizing, because the present had been the plans in progress rather than a life alongside the plans. He found in the first year after the divorce that the grief had two distinct registers that sometimes ran simultaneously and sometimes in alternation. Then one register was the grief of the marriage's ending, the loss of Margot, of the shared life, of the particular intimacy of two people who have known each other for 19 years. The other register was something harder to articulate, because its object was not a thing that had existed, but a thing that had been being built and was now not going to exist. And grief for something that was not going to exist, rather than something that has been lost, is a different kind of grief without an established vocabulary. He found vocabulary for it slowly across the first year, through the specific process of noticing when the harder register arrived and examining what it was pointing at. What it was pointing at was always a version of the future, a specific image from the plans, a particular detail of the chapter that was no longer going to happen in the form it had been being built toward. A house in a particular place, a way of spending a particular kind of day, a version of himself at a particular age and the company of the person he had expected to be in the company of. The grief was for the specific versions, rather than for the future in general, which made it more precise and more manageable than the general grief of a lost future would have been, and because the specific versions could be encountered and grieved individually, rather than in the undifferentiated mass of everything that was no longer going to happen. He is building new plans, not in the eager way of someone who has converted grief into optimism, in the careful way of someone who has understood what plans inside a marriage are and what they become when the marriage ends, and who is building the new ones with the specific awareness that plans built around a particular future can become indistinguishable from the present in a way that makes the loss of the future also the loss of the present. The new plans are held more lightly than the old ones were. He is not certain whether the lighter holding is wisdom or whether it is the protective guardedness of someone who has been through what the losing of long-built plans actually costs. He is still deciding which one, and is in no particular hurry to decide, which may itself be the answer. The grief for something not going to exist rather than something lost is the specific articulation this story makes that most grief narratives cannot make. The forward grief, the grief for the version of the future that was in active construction and is now not going to be built. The specific versions being more manageable than the general future grief is the right psychological observation about how this particular grief moves, and the lighter holding of the new plans being ambiguously wisdom or guardedness is the honest uncertainty that the ending of a long marriage produces about the building of what comes after. Someone spent 11 years married to a person who was, in the specific register of emotional intelligence, the most perceptive she had ever known, and discovered at the end of those years that the perceptiveness had been directed outward with a consistency that had never fully turned toward the marriage itself. Her husband's name was Neil, and the perceptiveness was genuinely his. She had valued it since the beginning of the relationship. which had formed partly around the specific quality of being seen accurately by someone who saw most people accurately, and who brought the same quality of attention to her that he brought to the world. He read people well. He understood dynamics in rooms before other people understood them. He anticipated what people needed with a precision that made him, in his professional life and in his social life, the person others sought out when the situation required someone who could read it clearly. What the 11 years produced, incrementally, and without either of them naming the increment, was the specific irony of a perceptive person whose perceptiveness had become so externally directed that it had stopped being applied with the same precision to the person he shared a house with. Not because his care for her had diminished. She does not believe his care diminished. Because the perceptiveness had a habitat, which was the novelty of new situations and new people, and the specific challenge of reading what was not immediately legible. And the marriage had become, across 11 years, legible to him in the way that long familiarity makes things legible, readable at a glance, requiring less of the attention that novelty demands. She had become, in his perceptiveness's economy, the known quantity. The known quantity does not require the sustained attention that the unknown quantity requires, and the sustained attention was where the perceptiveness lived. She had been receiving, for years without examining it, a version of his attention that was the maintenance version, rather than the active reading version. The attention of someone who believes they already know what they are looking at, rather than the attention of someone who is looking to find out. She noticed it first in the gap between how he described her to other people, accurately, warmly, with the specific detail of someone who knows a person well, and how he responded to her in moments when what she was feeling was different from what the known quantity would have been feeling. In those moments, the perceptiveness that was so reliable with strangers was slower, or missed the register, or offered the response that would have been right for the person he knew, rather than the person she was in that particular moment. The known quantity had become his working model, and the working model had stopped being updated with the same frequency that it had been updated in the early years. She raised it with him in year 9. The conversation was one of the more unusual she had had inside the marriage, because she was raising the absence of something rather than the presence of something. And the absence was the absence of his perceptiveness applied to her, which was difficult to name without sounding like she was saying he did not know her. He did know her, thoroughly, and with genuine depth. And the problem was not the depth of the knowing, but the frequency of the active re-knowing. The willingness to look again, rather than looking at the record of previous looking. Neil received it with the genuine surprise of someone who had believed his perceptiveness was one of the things the marriage most reliably contained. He could not immediately dispute it because the specific instances she offered were ones he recognized in retrospect as moments where he had responded to the working model rather than to what was actually present. He tried. The trying produced real change in the months that followed the conversation, and produced less change in the years that followed the months, which is the specific trajectory of a change that requires maintaining against a strong and long-established habit. The marriage ended in year 11 for reasons that included the perceptiveness problem, and included other things as well, and she holds the perceptiveness problem not as the cause, but as the thing the 11 years most specifically offered her to carry forward, which is the understanding that being known thoroughly is not the same as being actively attended to, and that the distinction between the two is something that long relationships must deliberately maintain rather than assume the earlier attention has permanently secured. The known quantity becoming the working model that stops being updated is the specific mechanism this story names. Not the loss of care, not the loss of knowledge, but the loss of the active re-knowing that the early attention had been providing, and that familiarity had quietly replaced with the existing record. Her difficulty, naming the absence without it sounding like an accusation of not knowing, is the precise communicative challenge that the absence of a thing, rather than the presence of a wrong thing, always produces, and the naming being possible, despite the difficulty, is what makes the Year 9 conversation worth having, even though the trajectory following it was imperfect. This one is from someone who was married for 8 years, and who found in the final conversation of the marriage something he had not expected to find, which was evidence that the marriage had been more significant to him than it had been to his wife, and that the asymmetry had been present from early in the marriage, and had been invisible to him across all 8 years of it. His wife's name was Serena, and she had been, across the 8 years, a fully present and genuinely engaged partner in the ways that he had been able to observe from inside the marriage. She had contributed to the shared life with consistency and care, and had not given him, at any point that he could identify in retrospect, a clear signal that her investment in the marriage was different in scale from his. The absence of the signal was what he had been working with, and it had produced a working understanding of the marriage as mutually significant, in the way that a good marriage is mutually significant. Each person inside it equally committed to what they have built together. The final conversation had a different quality from conversations that arrive at their subject gradually. Serena had come to it prepared in a way that told him the conversation had been organized in advance, and the organization was visible in the specific quality of what she said, clear and measured and complete in a way that suggested it had been assembled before it was delivered. He received it as a delivery and listened and understood, as she spoke, that what she was delivering was not only the end of the marriage, but an account of what the marriage had been that was different from the account he had been inside. Her account was that the marriage had been, from her side, a genuine and valued relationship that had nonetheless occupied a different position in her interior architecture than the position it had occupied in his. Not secondary. She was careful about the word secondary, and he received the carefulness as itself informative. Different in its position, less organizing of her sense of herself and her future than he had understood a marriage to be for both of the people in it. She had been inside the marriage with genuine investment, and with a portion of herself that was, she said, the portion a marriage of this kind warranted, which was not the portion he had given it, which was, in his accounting, close to everything. He did not argue the asymmetry. He sat with it across the final conversation, and into the days that followed, and he found that the asymmetry, once he had received it, was recognizable in the 8 years, in a way it had not been from inside them. It's not the signals he had missed. He examined for signals and did not find them, or did not find them clearly enough to have constituted signals, rather than ordinary variations in a relationship's texture. What he found instead was the absence of evidence of a quality he had assumed was present, the evidence that the marriage was organizing her interior architecture in the way it was organizing his. He had not looked for that evidence because he had assumed it, and the assumption had not been tested by anything the 8 years had produced. He has sat with the asymmetry for 3 years now, and has arrived at a place with it that is not comfortable and is honest, which is the place he has concluded is the right one for the specific thing the asymmetry represents. He had given the marriage more of himself than the marriage warranted in Serena's accounting, which is not something he would undo. The giving had been real and had come from a genuine place, and the genuineness of the giving is not revised by the asymmetry of what was received. He had loved more completely than he had been loved in the same way, and the completeness of the loving is something he holds as his, rather than as the thing the asymmetry diminished, because the asymmetry was Serena's and the completeness was his, and the two are separable in the way that things that belong to different people are separable even when they were inside the same marriage. The absence of evidence being different from evidence of absence is the careful distinction this story requires. He had not missed signals, he had failed to look for evidence of an assumption he had not known he was making. Serena's carefulness around the word secondary is the detail that makes her account credible rather than defensive. She is not diminishing the marriage. She is being precise about its position, which is a different thing and requires a different response. The separability of the completeness of his loving from the asymmetry of what was received is the specific piece of self-knowledge the 3 years have produced and the right place to find it. Here's one that moves through a different kind of terrain. From someone who was married for 6 years and who discovered that the thing her marriage had ended over was not the thing she had spent 3 years believing it had ended over. The thing she had believed it ended over was a specific conflict, a particular argument in the final year that had escalated into the conversation that had produced the ending, and one whose content she had spent 3 years examining for what it had ultimately cost them, and why it had cost that specifically. The conflict had been about something real, and the argument had been genuine, and she had understood the ending as the argument's outcome. The thing the argument had produced when it had exceeded what the marriage could absorb. The understanding was revised in year 3 through a conversation with her ex-husband, whose name was Patrick, that she had initiated for reasons unrelated to the marriage's ending. They had maintained a civil relationship after the divorce because the circumstances of their shared lives made civility necessary, and the civility had occasionally produced the kind of conversation that only the specific distance of post-marriage contact allows. In one of those conversations, Patrick said something that revised her understanding, not as his intention, but as the byproduct of him describing the final year from his side, which was a side she had not had access to in any complete form before. What Patrick described was a period in the final year that preceded the specific conflict, a period during which he had been aware that the marriage was not going to continue, and had not said so directly, because the directness had felt unavailable to him in the specific way that directness feels unavailable when the thing to be said is large and the consequences of saying it are ones you have not yet found a way to face. And he had been carrying the awareness for several months before the specific conflict, and the specific conflict had been, from his side, not the cause of the ending, but the occasion. The moment that provided the form for something that had already been true before the form was found. She received this with a stillness that surprised her. Not anger. She had expected anger, and had been preparing for the conversation to produce it, and it had not. What it produced instead was a significant revision of the 3 years of examination she had been conducting, which had been organized around the specific conflict as the cause, and which now had to be reorganized around the preceding months as the actual location of the ending. The specific conflict had not ended the marriage. The specific conflict had named the ending that had already occurred. The 3 years of examination had not been wasted. They had been examining the right marriage, in just the wrong event within it. She took the revision and applied it to the examination, and found that the questions it produced were different questions from the ones the specific conflict had produced. Questions about the months before the conflict and what had been happening in those months, that she had not been reading as the ending while she had been inside them. The different questions produced different answers, and the different answers produced, across the following months, a more complete understanding of the 6 years and their ending than the 3 years had produced. The completion arrived late and changed the character of the examination's conclusions, without invalidating the examination itself, which is the specific relationship between late information and prior work that most late information has. It revises rather than erases, which is the less dramatic and more accurate version of what information arriving after the fact does to the understanding that preceded it. The occasion versus the cause is the distinction this story is built around, and the distinction is one that most accounts of marriage endings cannot make, because most people on the inside of an ending experience the final event as causal, rather than as the form that a prior causation finally found. Patrick's inability to say the direct thing being named accurately as the specific unavailability of directness, when the thing to be said is large, is the honest description of how endings get deferred into occasions rather than named as causes when they first become true. The revision arriving in year 3 and reorganizing rather than invalidating the 3 years of prior examination, is the right relationship between the new information and the work that preceded it. And this one is from someone who found, in the paperwork of a divorce they had not expected to be filing, a version of their own signature from 14 years earlier that they did not recognize as theirs. The marriage certificate was among the documents they were required to produce for the divorce proceedings, and she had found it in a folder she had not opened since the year of the wedding, and had held it in the specific way of objects that contain a large distance between the moment of their creation and the moment of their being held again. The signature at the bottom of the certificate was hers. She knew it was hers, and it had a quality that she did not immediately have language for, which was the quality of something written by a hand that was in a different relationship to the thing it was signing than the relationship she was in now to the same document. The signature was confident in a way she recognized as the confidence of 29-year-old certainty, which is a different quality of confidence from the confidence available at 43. At 29, she had signed the certificate with the specific sureness of someone who had found what they were looking for and was certain of the finding. At 43, she was holding the evidence of the finding and processing the divorce the finding had produced. And the distance between the sureness in the signature and the complexity of the 43-year-old holding the document was the distance the 14 years had covered. She did not experience this as a signature being wrong. She wants to be clear about that because the temptation to revise the certainty of the 29-year-old into something more ironic or more cautionary than it was is one she has resisted. The 29-year-old had been certain with the information available to the 29-year-old, which was the complete information of that specific moment. The person she was then, the person her husband was then, the marriage they were entering then, that all of it real, and all of it informing a certainty that was proportionate to what the moment contained. The 14 years had added information that the signature could not have contained because the 14 years had not yet happened. Her husband's name was James, and the divorce had arrived through the ordinary and particular accumulation of two people becoming different people across 14 years, and discovering that the different people were not configured for the same future that the same people had been configured for when they had signed the certificates. The discovery had been gradual enough that there was no specific moment she could point to as the moment the configuration changed. It had changed continuously, in the way that people change, and the change had accumulated to a point where the distance between who they were and who they had been when they had signed was large enough that the marriage being built around the signed version felt like a structural problem rather than a natural evolution. She filed the certificate back into the folder after the divorce proceedings had concluded, and the specific decision not to discard it that she has examined since. The decision was not sentiment. She is clear about this, or as clear as anyone can be about their own motivations. The decision was closer to the acknowledgement that the 29-year-old certainty was a real thing that deserved to be held rather than discarded, even though what it had been certain about had not survived the 14 years in the form the certainty had imagined. The certainty had been real. The marriage it had produced had been real, and the divorce that the marriage had produced was real. All three things were in the folder, and all three things were hers, and the holding of all three was the most honest available relationship to the 14 years and everything they had contained. The signature as the object that holds the entire arc of the story is what this closing entry earns. Not a conversation, not a discovery, not an external revelation, but the narrator in a room with a document from their own past, and reading the distance between who signed it and who is holding it. The resistance to revising the 29-year-old certainty into irony is the specific maturity that keeps this story from being a simple story about naivety, which it is not. The certainty was proportionate to the moment's information. The 14 years added information the moment could not have contained. The holding of all three things, the certainty, the marriage, and the divorce, as equally real and equally hers, is where the story finds its ending. Someone spent 17 years married and discovered in the final months of the marriage that the person they had been arguing with for the last 3 of those years was not the person they had actually been in conflict with, and that the actual conflict had a source neither of them had been looking at directly. Her husband's name was Conrad, and the 3 years of arguments had been about the things that 3 years of arguments in a long marriage are usually about: the distribution of responsibility, the management of the household, the specific and recurring disagreements about how shared decisions should be made and who should make them. The arguments had a texture of familiarity that long-running arguments develop, the specific quality of two people who know each other's positions so thoroughly that each argument rehearses the positions rather than examining them, and the rehearsal had been producing heat without producing the understanding that the heat was supposed to be moving toward. She entered therapy in year 15 for reasons she described to the therapist as being about the arguments, and found across the following months that the therapy was producing a picture of the arguments that was different from the picture she had been bringing into them. The picture the therapy produced had the arguments as the surface of something, and the something as a question she had not been asking directly, which was whether the life the marriage had built was the life she had actually wanted to build, or whether it was the life she had built because it was available and because she had been, at the point of building it, someone who had not yet known clearly enough what she wanted to choose on the basis of wanting, rather than on the basis of what was in front of her. The question was uncomfortable in the specific way of questions that have been avoided successfully for a long time. The avoidance had been so complete that the question had not even been present as an avoided thing. It had simply been absent, and its arrival in therapy was the arrival of something new, rather than the naming of something she had known was there. She sat with it for a year before she had a version of the answer she could bring to Conrad, and the version she brought was incomplete in the way that answers to this kind of question are always incomplete, but it was the most honest version available. She told Conrad that the arguments had been about the wrong things, not that the wrong things were unimportant, but that they had been the available language for something she had not had language for, which was the more fundamental question of whether the life they had built together was the life that was actually hers. She told him this with the specific care of someone who understands that what they are saying has implications that the other person has not yet had time to process. Conrad received it with a silence that lasted longer than the silences their arguments had produced. He asked her whether she knew the answer to the question she had been asking in therapy. She said she did not know it completely, and that she knew enough of it to say that the version of the question she had been asking in the arguments had been keeping both of them from the actual question for 3 years, and that the 3 years had cost them both something they had been spending without knowing it. They spent 4 months attempting to have the actual conversation, rather than the argument version of it, which required a different quality of honesty from both of them than the arguments had required. The actual conversation produced understanding, and did not produce the repair the marriage needed, which was not because the understanding was insufficient, but because the question she had been asking had a direction that the understanding had confirmed rather than redirected. As the marriage ended with more mutual comprehension of what it had been and what it had contained than the 3 years of arguments had produced, which she holds as the most that the ending could have offered, and exactly what it did. The arguments as the available language for a question that had not yet found its actual language is the specific mechanism this story names. Not dishonesty, not avoidance in the conscious sense, but the use of what is available to express what is not yet articulable, which is what most people do with the things they cannot yet say directly. The 4 months of actual conversation being more honest than the 3 years of arguments and still not producing the repair is the honest accounting of what understanding can and cannot do in a marriage that has reached the edge of its own question. This one is from a man who was married for 25 years and who found, and in the specific experience of being the person left rather than the person leaving, that the two positions produce entirely different relationships to the same ending. His wife's name was Catherine, and she was the one who had arrived at the conclusion, and the conclusion had been delivered to him on a Wednesday evening in October, with the care of someone who had been preparing the delivery for long enough that the care was thorough, and the thoroughness was itself a communication about how long the preparation had been occurring. He received it on a Wednesday evening in October, with no preparation at all, which is the specific condition of the person being told. You are in an ordinary Wednesday evening, and then you are in the ending of a 25-year marriage. And the transition between those two states happens in the space of a sentence. He spent the first year in the specific condition of someone who is processing an ending they did not choose, which is different from processing an ending they participated in choosing, and the difference organizes everything about how the processing moves. He had no agency in the decision. He had been building toward a future that Catherine had been building away from, and the building in opposite directions had been occurring simultaneously for long enough that the divergence had become irreversible before he had known it was occurring. The not knowing was not ignorance. He had not been incurious about the marriage. He had not been inattentive. The direction of Catherine's private conclusion had simply not been visible to him, and its invisibility had not been the product of a failure of his looking. What the first year produced, alongside the grief, was a sustained and often involuntary examination of the 25 years for the signs he had missed. He was looking for them not to reverse the ending, which was not reversible, but because the mind of someone who has been left does a specific thing, which is to attempt to assemble the information that would have made the ending make sense before it arrived rather than after, and to blame itself for the failure to have assembled that information in advance. He found some signs, and he found that the signs were ambiguous, in the way that signs always are when they are being read backward from the conclusion they were supposed to predict. The ambiguity was real, and the conclusion the signs were being recruited to support was not something the signs had clearly indicated before the conclusion was known. He arrived, through the second year's more measured examination, at a position he had not expected to arrive at, which was that the not knowing had not been his failure. Catherine had arrived at her conclusion privately, and had carried it privately for the period of her preparation, and the carrying had been, in her telling, and in his eventual understanding of it, the carrying of someone who was protecting him from information she had not yet found the form to deliver. The protection had not been cruelty. The protection had been its own kind of care, imperfect in its effects and genuine in its intention, and he'd been inside the protection for the duration, without knowing he was being protected. He is not uncomplicated about this. 3 years out of the 25, he holds Catherine with a warmth that surprises him, and with a specific unresolved quality that he does not think will resolve, which is the question of whether the protection of the preparation period was something she owed him the earlier disclosure of, regardless of whether she had found the form for it yet. He holds the question as his rather than directing it at Catherine, because the directing would require a verdict he is not certain he has the standing to deliver on something that happened inside her own private process, and that he was not present for. He holds it as an open question about what people owe each other during the private period, before a significant decision, and he has found no answer he is entirely satisfied with, and has decided that dissatisfaction is the honest resting place for it. The transition from ordinary Wednesday evening to the ending of a 25-year marriage, happening in the space of a sentence, is the image that opens this story correctly. The absolute specificity of what it is to be the person being told, rather than the person telling, the mind's backward assembly of signs that were ambiguous before the conclusion was known, is the accurate description of what the grief of the left person does in its first year. And the arrival at the position that the not knowing was not his failure is the work of the second year named honestly as work, rather than as a natural landing. The open question about what people owe each other during the preparation period, being held as his rather than directed at Catherine, is the specific maturity that 3 years has produced, and the right relationship to a question that does not admit of a clean answer. The last story tonight is from someone who was married for 31 years and who found, in the year after the divorce was finalized, that the thing she was grieving most was not the marriage or the person or the life, but the particular and unrepeatable experience of having been known by someone across a significant span of time, and the understanding that the kind of knowing a 31-year marriage produces is not a thing that can be rebuilt from the beginning at 62. Her husband's name was Robert, and the marriage had been good and then difficult, and then something she and Robert had examined together and found, at the end of the examination, to be more honestly concluded than continued. The ending was mutual and was arrived at with the specific sobriety of two people who have been together long enough to know the difference between a marriage that is repairable and one that has reached the outer edge of what repair can do. They had been honest with each other throughout the ending, which is the legacy of 31 years of practice at honesty, even when honesty was the harder available option. The grief she had anticipated was the grief of the marriage itself, of Robert, of the shared life, of the specific intimacy of two people who have built something across 3 decades and are now in the process of acknowledging that the building has concluded. That grief arrived and was what she had understood it would be, and she moved through it with the tools she had and the support she had arranged, and the specific steadiness of someone who has been through difficult things before and has evidence that difficult things can be moved through. The grief she had not anticipated arrived in its own time and had a different object. It was the grief of the knowing, the specific and accumulated knowing that 31 years produces, the kind that lives in the bones of the person who has it, rather than in any single piece of information or any specific memory. Robert knew her in the way that only 31 years of sustained and genuine attention produces in a person. The small things and the large things, and the things she had never said explicitly, but that the 31 years had made legible to him without the saying. The knowing had been the ground of the marriage, present beneath everything that happened in it, and the divorce was removing the ground rather than any particular thing that stood on it. She understood at 62, with a specificity she had not had before, what it meant to be known across a long time by another person. She had understood it while she was inside it in the abstract way that you understand things you have always had, without the full understanding of the thing's weight that only the loss of it produces. The loss produced the understanding with a completeness that the 31 years of having it had not required, which is the specific irony of the most important things in a life. Their weight becomes fully legible only at their removal. She is not without people who know her. She has close friends of long standing and children who have known her across their own lifetimes and relationships that contain genuine knowing of various depths and durations. What she does not have and understands she will not rebuild is the specific kind of knowing that 31 years of sustained daily proximity with the same person produces. The knowing that has seen you across decades, that contains the versions of you that have not been saved anywhere else, that is the only living record of who you were in the years the knowing covers. Robert has that record. She has his. And they are the custodians of each other's longest record, and the custodianship continues past the divorce in a way that is different from the marriage, but is not nothing. They are still the people who hold the most complete version of each other's story, and the holding continues in the specific and complicated way of something that has survived what it was built inside. She has made her peace with the 62-year-old version of what comes next, which is not the peace of someone who has resolved the grief, but the peace of someone who has understood it accurately enough to stop requiring it to be different from what it is. The grief is real and is the accurate response to a real loss, and the accurate response is the one she has decided to give it, not managed into something more comfortable, not converted into a narrative of recovery, that the grief does not yet warrant, but held as what it is, which is the weight of 31 years and the specific and unrepeatable knowing they produced, being carried by the person who remains, forward into the years that come next. Someone spent 12 years married to a person who was, in the specific texture of daily life, easy to live with, and discovered at the end of those 12 years that easy to live with and easy to be known by are not the same thing, and that she had been confusing them for the duration. And her husband's name was Owen, and the easiness was real, in the ways that matter most for the daily architecture of a shared life. He was undemanding and even-tempered, and the house ran with a low friction that she had understood as compatibility, as the sign of two people whose habits and tolerances and basic orientations to the world were well enough matched that the ordinary sources of marital difficulty were simply not features of what they had. She had told people this. She had believed it. The 12 years had produced nothing that contradicted it in any visible form. What she found in the ending was that the low friction had been produced not only by compatibility, but by a specific quality of Owen's engagement with her, which was a quality of acceptance so complete that it had never required her to be distinct from what she presented. He accepted what she offered. He did not push past what she offered into the version of her that was behind it. He was not incurious. She does not believe he was incurious. But his curiosity had a specific limit, which was the limit of what was comfortable to receive, and she had learned across 12 years the shape of that limit without naming it, and had organized her self-presentation around it without examining the organizing. The result was a marriage in which she had been consistently comfortable and consistently partial in the sense of presenting the portion of herself that the marriage's specific easiness had space for, and withholding without design the portions that the easiness did not have space for. The withheld portions were not dramatic. They were the ordinary edges and complications of a full person. The opinions she had found it easier not to introduce, and the needs she had found it easier to redirect. The specific interior weather that the marriage's low-friction atmosphere had made it uncomfortable to import. She had managed these things so consistently that the management had become the version of herself she brought to the marriage, and she had stopped noticing that the version was managed rather than complete, and the noticing came through a friendship rather than through the marriage. A close friendship with a woman who asked the kind of questions that Owen had not asked, who pushed past the offered version into the version behind it in the way that some people do, naturally, and that the 12 years had made unfamiliar to her. The friendship produced across 2 years the specific experience of being known more completely than the marriage had been producing, and the experience was uncomfortable and clarifying simultaneously, and the clarification had a direction that she eventually had to bring to Owen. She told him what she had understood through the comparison, not as an accusation, and not with the friendship as the primary subject, with the marriage as the primary subject, and the understanding she had arrived at about what the marriage had been containing. Nain Owen received it with a stillness that told her the understanding was landing with the weight it deserved. He did not dispute the description. He said he had believed she was giving him all of herself, and he had not known to look for the portion she was managing around the limit he had apparently been setting, without knowing he was setting it. They tried for a year. The trying produced the specific difficulty of two people who are attempting to change the fundamental character of a dynamic that 12 years have established, which is that the change is real in the trying and does not naturalize into the relationship with the speed that the trying requires for the relationship to feel genuinely different rather than deliberately maintained. The marriage ended with more honesty between them than the 12 years had contained, which is the specific and complicated gift that an ending sometimes produces. The full conversation arriving at the conclusion, rather than in time to change it. The confusion between easy to live with and easy to be known by is the specific distinction the story earns, and the one that makes it worth placing alongside the others tonight. The two things are not opposites. Someone can be both or neither, but they are distinct. Arautau, and the distinctness matters for what a marriage actually provides to the person inside it. The management of the self around the limit of another person's comfortable receiving is something that happens in long relationships without the manager noticing the managing, and the noticing requires a contrast that the relationship itself cannot provide. This one arrives from someone who was married for 8 years and who found in the aftermath of the divorce that the version of herself she had been inside. The marriage was not a diminished version, it was a protected one, and the protection had costs she had not examined. Her husband's name was Simon, and the protection was structural rather than deliberate. It was the specific protection that a strong and confident person's presence provides to the person who loves them, the way that someone who moves through the world with ease creates a kind of shelter in their immediate vicinity that the people close to them can live inside. She had been inside Simon's shelter from the first year of the relationship and had valued the shelter for what it genuinely was, which was real and was warm, and had allowed her to inhabit the early years of their life, together with a security that she had not had before the relationship. The cost of the shelter was not visible from inside it. Inside the shelter, she was secure and supported, and the world's ordinary difficulties arrived pre-filtered through Simon's capacity to handle them, which meant she encountered a reduced version of the ordinary difficulties rather than the full version, which meant she had not been developing the specific capacities that the full version would have developed. She had been, inside the shelter, a version of herself that was more comfortable and less capable than she would have been outside it, and the comfort had made the capability question invisible, because comfort and capability feel the same when you are not being asked to distinguish them. The divorce was not about the shelter. She wants to be clear about this because the shelter was not the problem in the way that a problem ends a marriage. It was something she understood about the marriage retrospectively, rather than something that produced the ending. The ending had its own causes and its own trajectory, and the shelter understanding arrived in the aftermath, rather than as a contribution to the conclusion. What the aftermath required was the full version of the ordinary difficulties, the ones that had been arriving pre-filtered through Simon, and that now arrived unfiltered in a life that no longer contained the filter. The unfiltered version was harder than she had expected, and harder than she would have found it if the 8 years had not been inside the shelter, which is the specific cost of the protection becoming visible at the point of its removal. She was less prepared for the ordinary difficulties of her own life at 38 than she would have been if the 8 years had not provided the specific pre-filtering that they had. She does not frame this as Simon's fault, and she does not frame it as her own. The shelter had been the natural product of the relationship's specific configuration, his strength and her willingness to be near it, and the configuration had been chosen and maintained by both of them, without either of them examining what the choosing was producing. The examination arrived post-divorce, which is late, and the lateness is simply the timing the situation produced, rather than a failure of earlier attention. When 3 years into the unfiltered version of her own life, she is more capable than she was at the divorce, and less capable than she would like to be, and more honest about the gap than she was during the 8 years. The honesty is the outcome she values most from the 3 years, not the capability, which is developing on its own schedule and will continue to develop. In Ase, but the honesty about what the shelter had been, and what living outside it actually requires, and what she is into the process of becoming, without the pre-filtering that the marriage had provided. She is becoming that person slowly, and with the specific patience of someone who understands that the development is real, even when it does not feel fast enough. The protection and the cost being inseparable from each other is the structure of this story. You cannot have the shelter's benefit without incurring the shelter's cost, and the incurring is invisible inside the shelter, because the benefit is what is available to feel. The capability gap becoming legible at the point of the shelter's removal is what makes the divorce the site of the understanding rather than the marriage. Which is the right location because the marriage could not have provided the contrast that the removal provided. The last story tonight is from someone who spent 20 years married and who found, in so specific and ordinary moment of signing the final divorce documents, that the act of signing contained something she had not expected to find there. She had been through the preceding months of the legal process with the specific endurance of someone who has understood that an ending requires its procedures, and that the procedures must be moved through, regardless of what they cost. The procedures had cost. The paperwork and the negotiations and the mediation sessions and the financial disclosures and the interim agreements and the final agreements, all of it had been moved through with a steadiness she had maintained as the organizing principle of the process, because the alternative to steadiness was something she had not been willing to offer to the process or to her children or to herself. The signing was on a Thursday morning in a lawyer's office, and her husband, whose name was David, I was not present. The documents had been signed by him on the previous day, and she was completing her portion in his absence, which was the logistics of the final step, rather than a deliberate arrangement, but which produced, in the event, something she had not anticipated. She had expected to sign and to feel the specific quality of a conclusion, the arrival at the end of a procedural sequence, the legal finalization of something that had been in process for 14 months. She had not expected what she found instead. What she found was grief that was different from the grief she had been carrying for 14 months. The 14 months of procedural grief had been the grief of someone moving through a process, purposeful and directed and organized around the sequence of steps the process required. The grief that arrived at the signing was the grief of someone at the end of the sequence, standing at the conclusion of the process rather than inside it, and with nothing procedural remaining to organize the feeling around. The procedure had been holding the grief in a form that was navigable, and the procedure was now complete, and the grief was now without its container. She sat in the lawyer's office for longer than the signing required. The lawyer was present and patient in the way of lawyers, who have witnessed this specific moment many times, and understand what it asks of the person in the chair. She sat with the signed documents in front of her, and she allowed the grief its full form for the first time in 14 months. Not the procedural version, not the endurance version, but the complete version that the process had been deferring, and that the completion of the process had finally released. 20 years. She had signed something 20 years before, with the specific certainty of someone who had found what they were looking for, and she was signing something, now that was the conclusion of what the first signing had begun. And the distance between the two signings contained everything. The years and the children, and the shared life, and the difficulty, and the ending, and all of it had been held inside the two documents, the first and the last last was now signed, and the everything the distance contained was now a completed arc, rather than an ongoing one. She drove home from the lawyer's office in the specific altered state of someone who has just completed something large. The day was ordinary in all its other features, the traffic and the weather and the errands she had planned for the afternoon, and she moved through the ordinary features of the day with the specific quality of someone who is carrying something significant, while the world continues at its regular pace, which is the specific experience of significant personal events in ordinary days, and which she has found to be one of the more quietly human things about the way that significant things arrive and are held and are eventually absorbed into the ongoing texture of a life. The documents are in a folder, both of them, the first and the last. She has not decided what to do with the folder, and she has stopped requiring herself to decide before she knows. The folder is the full arc in paper form, and the full arc deserves to be held, rather than immediately processed into a decision about its disposition. She will know what to do with it when she knows. Until then, it sits in the place she has put it and contains what it contains. And she is in the ongoing project of understanding what the 20 years have left her with and what they have left her as. which is a project without a completion date, and which she has decided to hold as the ongoing condition of a person who has been through something significant, rather than as a problem to be resolved. 38 stories tonight, 38 accounts of what it is to enter into the longest kind of commitment and to discover, inside it or at its ending or in the years that follow, something about the commitment and about yourself that the commitment itself was the only classroom for. And every person in tonight's stories signed something once, or said something once, or chose someone once with whatever they had. And then they lived inside the choosing for years, some of them for decades. And the living produced the understanding that the choosing had not contained. That is not a failure of the choosing. That is simply what living produces. That choosing cannot, which is the specific and irreplaceable knowledge of what a thing is when you have been inside it long enough to know. The endings are not the point. The marriages are not the point. The point is somewhere in the middle, in the years of the actual living, in the specific and ordinary and occasionally extraordinary experience of two people attempting to know each other and be known and build something in the space between what each of them is. Some of them built something that lasted. Some built something that concluded. All of them built something, and the building was real, regardless of what the building produced. If you have been inside any version of what tonight described, if you recognize the shelter or the private list, or the signature from 20 years ago that belongs to a hand you no longer fully recognize as yours, then you know what the building costs and what it gives. You know it into the way that only the living of it provides. Get some rest. I will see you next time.